Just hours after my divorce was finalized, I boarded a one-way flight to Glasgow with my two children, while my ex-husband and his entire family gathered at a luxury maternity clinic to celebrate his mistress's ultrasound. The doctor delivered news that shattered their perfect world forever. The test results revealed a secret that left them completely speechless and turned their celebration into a police emergency. I am Cassidy, 30 years old and a medical illustrator. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the Boston family courthouse buzzed above us, casting a sickly pale glow over the polished marble floors. I sat across the heavy wooden table from the man I had spent the last decade of my life with. Liam sat back in his chair with a posture of absolute victory. Beside him sat Brittany, the 24-year-old gym receptionist he had been sleeping with for the past year. She was chewing gum loudly, her hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded belly. Standing right behind Liam were my now former in-laws, Patricia and Richard. They looked like they were attending a victory parade rather than a divorce proceeding. Liam reached into his expensive tailored suit jacket, the exact same one I had bought him for his promotion to tech sales manager 2 years ago, and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the table toward me with a slow and deliberate smirk. "You should come," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is the baby shower for my actual heir. We are hosting it at the country club next month." I did not touch the envelope. I simply stared at the gold foil lettering that spelled out Brittany and Liam's new beginning. Patricia leaned forward, her heavy diamond necklace clinking against the table. "You really should consider yourself lucky, Cassidy," she said loudly, making sure the court clerk at the other end of the room could hear every word. "My son is a generous man. He could have demanded half of that meager savings account of yours. Heaven knows those pitiful freelance doodles you call a career barely bring in enough to pay for your own groceries." My pitiful freelance doodles. That was how my mother-in-law had always described my work as a medical illustrator. In her eyes, because I did not work in a corporate skyscraper or climb a traditional management ladder, my career was just an embarrassing hobby. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was not contributing properly to her son's upscale lifestyle. Liam leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. "Let us get this over with," he said, tapping a pen against the final stack of legal documents. "Here is the deal, Cassidy. You want full custody of Leo and Zoe. I am willing to give it to you, completely. I will sign away all my parental rights right now." He paused for dramatic effect, ensuring his parents were watching his masterful negotiation tactics. "But in exchange, you sign away any right to alimony or child support. Every single penny. You take the kids, and you take the financial burden entirely on yourself. I am starting a new family with Brittany, and I am not going to let you drain my bank accounts just because your little art projects cannot pay the rent." He pushed the thick stack of papers toward me. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man who had remained mostly silent throughout the morning, gave a curt nod of confirmation. "You are going to starve, Cassidy!" Liam boasted, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "Within 6 months, you will be crawling back begging me for child support. A starving artist like you cannot possibly raise a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old in this economy. But when you do come crying to me, remember that you signed this away today." Brittany giggled, popping her gum again. "Liam is going to provide for our baby," she chimed in, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We need the money for the nursery renovations anyway." I looked down at the documents. The terms were absolutely clear and intentionally brutal. By signing, I was absolving him of all financial responsibility for the 2 beautiful children we had brought into this world together. He thought he was trapping me in a life of poverty and endless struggle. He thought he was securing his own wealth and punishing me for daring to want out of his toxic and manipulative grasp. He wanted to see me break. I picked up the pen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not argue, and I certainly did not plead. I simply signed my name on the dotted line, feeling an overwhelming sense of liberation wash over my entire body. What Liam, Brittany, Patricia, and Richard did not know was that my pitiful freelance doodles were actually highly specialized, scientifically accurate medical illustrations used in advanced surgical textbooks and global pharmaceutical campaigns. They also did not know that just 3 weeks ago, I had secured a multi-million-dollar exclusive contract with the International Medical Research Institute at Glasgow University in Scotland. As Liam smugly watched me sign away his financial obligations, he had absolutely no idea that my signing also legally severed his access to my newfound wealth. Because we were officially divorced before my new contract commenced, he could not touch a single cent of the millions I was about to earn. I had already quietly liquidated my minor local assets and transferred everything into secure offshore accounts. I was not walking away with nothing. I was walking away with everything that mattered, including my children, and leaving him alone with his inflated ego. I neatly stacked the papers and slid them back across the huge wooden table. The clerk stamped the final decree with a loud thud that echoed in the quiet room. We were finally done. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and looked at the four of them celebrating their hollow victory. "Enjoy your new life, Liam," I said calmly, making sure my voice betrayed absolutely no emotion. I turned on my heel and walked out of the courthouse and into the crisp Boston air. I left them to their arrogant celebration, completely unaware of the absolute storm that was about to hit them. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, washing away the stagnant, suffocating atmosphere of the last 10 years. I did not look back. A sleek black car was already idling at the curb, its driver stepping out to open the door the very second he spotted me. Inside, Leo and Lily were waiting, their faces pressed eagerly against the tinted windows. They had their backpacks stuffed with their favorite books and tablets, entirely oblivious to the fact that their father had just legally erased himself from their lives for the sake of his own vanity. To them, we were simply embarking on a grand adventure across the ocean. To me, we were finally free. We glided seamlessly through the dense Boston traffic, leaving the familiar skyline and all its bitter memories behind, as we headed straight for Logan International Airport. We bypassed the chaotic main terminals and moved swiftly through the priority security lines, escorted directly to the International Departure Lounge. Within an hour, we were boarding our flight. The flight attendants greeted us warmly by name, guiding us to our spacious business class pods. Leo scrambled into his seat, his eyes wide with absolute amazement as he discovered the flatbed features and the massive, interactive entertainment screen. Lily giggled softly as a flight attendant offered her a warm towel and a selection of children's movies to watch during the long journey. I settled into my own pod, sinking into the plush leather, and letting out a deep breath I felt like I had been holding for months. The contrast between this quiet, elevated luxury and the miserable poverty Liam had gleefully predicted for me was sharp and incredibly satisfying. He truly believed I would be crying in a cramped, unheated apartment tonight, stressing over grocery bills and utility cutoffs while begging him for scraps. Instead, I was watching my children safely cocooned in premier comfort, ready to cross the Atlantic to a life of immense privilege. My new role at the International Medical Research Institute awaited, bringing with it a level of professional respect and financial security Liam could not even begin to comprehend. As I adjusted my seatbelt, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. I picked it up, intending to switch it to airplane mode, but a push notification caught my eye and made me pause. It was an automated alert from the premium health insurance provider Liam and I had previously shared. In his arrogant, frantic haste to finalize the divorce and replace me with a younger model, Liam had completely neglected his basic administrative tasks. He had forgotten to remove my email address from the primary emergency contact list on his account. I tapped the notification and a highly detailed digital receipt loaded onto my screen. It was a secure alert regarding Brittany. Her advanced, non-invasive prenatal testing genetic screening results had just been fully processed by the laboratory and successfully forwarded directly to their designated VIP maternity clinic. I stared at the digital receipt, a slow, knowing smile spreading across my face. As a professional medical illustrator, I spent my days diagramming complex biological systems, cellular structures, and genetic sequencing for top-tier medical journals and research facilities. I knew exactly what an NIPT entailed. It was a standard yet highly comprehensive blood test that expectant mothers took to screen for chromosomal abnormalities and determine the biological gender of the baby. However, it also mapped out precise genetic markers, inherited traits, and unmistakable DNA blueprints. I did not need to hack into the clinic's secure server or read the actual medical file to know what was inside that sealed envelope. The truth was already locked and loaded, hurtling straight toward Liam's fragile, ego-driven world. The dominoes had been perfectly aligned, and that automated email was the undeniable confirmation that the very first one was about to fall. I opened my phone settings, navigated to the cellular menu, and selected my American eSIM card profile. With one firm, deliberate tap, I deleted it completely. My phone immediately dropped its connection to the local cellular network, severing my final digital tie to the United States, to my toxic former in-laws, and to Liam. I was untraceable. I was unreachable. I set the phone down on the console, picked up my crystal glass, and took a long, refreshing sip of sparkling water as the plane engines roared to life. The massive aircraft surged forward, lifting off the runway and ascending into the thick clouds, carrying me toward the Scottish Highlands and a brilliant new beginning. Meanwhile, miles beneath my ascending flight, a very different kind of gathering was taking place across Boston. The entire extended family of my former in-laws was currently arriving at an exclusive, ridiculously overpriced VIP maternity clinic in the heart of the city. Patricia had insisted on making an absolute spectacle of the appointment, treating a standard medical visit like a Hollywood red carpet event. She had demanded that everyone be present to witness the grand reveal of Liam's new heir, wanting to document the moment for her pretentious social media circles. Liam Brittany, Patricia Richard, Liam's golden boy brother Jason, his deeply insecure sister Stephanie, and Stephanie's husband Jamal, who stood quietly near the back, were all crowding into the plush, aggressively decorated waiting room. They were loud, overly triumphant, arrogantly boasting to the exhausted receptionists, and completely unaware that the sealed medical envelope sitting on the doctor's mahogany desk inside that clinic was about to detonate their perfectly curated lives into absolute, irreparable ruin. The plush, aggressively decorated waiting room was only the beginning of their extravagant display. Eager to appease their notoriously wealthy and demanding clients, the clinic staff quickly ushered the entire loud entourage into the largest VIP ultrasound suite available. The room resembled a high-end hotel lounge far more than a medical facility. Soft ambient lighting glowed from recessed ceiling fixtures, casting a warm hue over the expensive white leather seating arranged in a wide semicircle. A massive flat-screen monitor covered the focal wall, specifically designed to broadcast the ultrasound in high definition so no one would miss a single detail. The air smelled faintly of lavender and sterile alcohol, a clinical scent that was completely masked by the overwhelming cloud of Patricia's expensive floral perfume. Patricia immediately took charge of the room as if she were directing a grand stage play. She ordered Richard to set up the tripod for her phone, determined to capture every single second of this momentous occasion for her family vlog. Her social media followers needed to see the undeniable proof of the perfect lineage continuing, and she was not going to let a mundane medical setting ruin her aesthetic. Richard, ever the obedient husband, adjusted the camera angle and then popped the cork on a bottle of premium champagne they had smuggled in. The loud pop echoed off the acoustic panels, followed by loud, obnoxious cheers from Liam and his golden boy brother Jason. Jason leaned against an expensive medical cart, casually swirling his glass while checking his stock portfolio on his phone, perfectly playing the role of the supportive, successful uncle. Jamal, Stephanie's husband, stood quietly near the back corner, sipping his drink and trying his absolute best to stay out of the camera's view. In the center of it all, Liam was putting on a sickening display of masculine pride. He puffed out his chest, pacing back and forth in front of the leather examination chair where Brittany was getting comfortable. He gloated loudly about his virility, making sure his voice carried loud enough for his parents and the camera microphone to capture every single word. He boasted that it took a real man to secure a true heir, making thinly veiled derogatory remarks about my supposed inability to give him a proper legacy. He went on and on about the superior genetics he was passing down, claiming that his future son would inherit his athletic prowess and brilliant mind. He toasted to his own greatness, practically strutting around the medical equipment as if he owned the entire building. The level of delusion was staggering, especially considering his entire lifestyle had been quietly funded and managed by my hard work for the past 10 years. Brittany was absolutely basking in the rich family's unwavering attention. She had her blonde hair perfectly styled and wore a designer maternity dress that Liam had undoubtedly paid for with funds he was actively trying to hide from the divorce settlement. She giggled at every terrible joke Liam made, soaking up the lavish compliments Patricia kept throwing her way. Patricia fawned over Brittany, adjusting the young girl's blanket, and loudly declaring that she could already tell the baby was going to have Liam's strong jawline. Brittany just smiled vacantly, completely oblivious to the shifting dynamics in the room. She was too busy admiring her own reflection in the blank ultrasound monitor, and occasionally pausing to ensure her perfectly manicured hands were visible whenever Patricia pointed the vlog camera in her direction. She treated the medical appointment like a luxury spa day, completely failing to notice the dark, venomous looks she was receiving from the corner. Stephanie stood rigid next to Jamal, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were narrowed into dangerous slits as she stared daggers at Brittany. For her entire life, Stephanie had struggled to maintain her mother's approval, constantly competing with Jason and Liam for a scrap of validation. Now she was watching a 24-year-old gym receptionist waltz in and instantly become the center of the family universe. Stephanie's gaze locked onto the brand-new limited edition designer handbag resting on the chair next to Brittany, a bag Stephanie had begged her parents for just last Christmas and been denied. Her jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped in her cheek. Jamal, sensing the explosive tension radiating from his wife, gently placed a hand on Stephanie's arm in a silent attempt to calm her down. Stephanie violently shrugged him off, refusing to break her death glare. She was practically vibrating with resentment, disgusted that her parents were treating this mistress like royalty while constantly criticizing her own life choices. The loud celebrations and arrogant boasting were abruptly interrupted by the heavy click of the suite's oak door opening. The room fell into a temporary hush as Dr. Evans stepped inside. He was a senior physician at the clinic, usually known for his warm bedside manner and enthusiastic congratulations. Today, however, his demeanor was strikingly different. His face was unnaturally pale, completely drained of color. He stood rigidly near the doorway, holding a thick, securely sealed medical envelope in his hands. He was sweating slightly along his brow, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the champagne, the tripod, and the overwhelming number of family members crammed into the space. He looked deeply physically uncomfortable. Dr. Evans cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, as he took a hesitant step toward the center of the room. Instead of offering the usual cheerful greetings, he walked straight past Brittany and approached Liam. He lowered his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper, attempting to maintain some semblance of medical discretion. He quietly asked Liam if they could step out into the hallway for a private conversation regarding the genetic screening results. Liam frowned, his ego instantly bristling at the suggestion of being pulled away from his audience. Before he could even respond, Patricia marched forward, entirely offended by the interruption of her perfect family narrative. "Absolutely not," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. She reached out and physically angled the smartphone on the tripod so the lens pointed directly at the doctor's pale face. "We are filming this for the family vlog. My followers have been waiting all week for this update. We have no secrets here, doctor. Read the results aloud right now. We want to celebrate the good news together." Dr. Evans shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly agonizing over the ethical and professional nightmare he had just walked into. He tried one last time to appeal to Liam's common sense, stepping closer and lowering his voice even further, insisting that medical test results of this nature truly needed to be discussed in a private, confidential setting before being shared with extended relatives. But Liam, fueled by champagne and pure narcissism, aggressively waved off the professional advice. He placed a heavy, demanding hand on the doctor's shoulder and loudly ordered him to stop stalling and give them the grand announcement they came for. Dr. Evans looked from Liam to Patricia, then down at the sealed envelope. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a steep cliff, knowing he was about to push them all over the side. His hands visibly trembled as he broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the crisp, white laboratory report. He took a long, shaky breath, the kind of breath someone takes before delivering devastating news. The room went dead silent, the only sound the faint hum of the ultrasound machine and the soft whir of the air conditioning. The doctor cleared his throat one final time, his eyes fixed firmly on the paper so he would not have to look at any of them. "The fetus is perfectly healthy," he announced, his voice tight and completely devoid of joy. "All major developmental markers are normal. However, the genetic screening shows an unexpected anomaly. The baby carries the sickle cell trait." Liam let out a short, dismissive bark of laughter, shaking his head, as if the senior physician had just flubbed the punchline of a terrible joke. He looked around the room, expecting the rest of his family to join in his amusement. "Sickle cell trait." Liam repeated, his tone dripping with arrogant incredulity. "Look at me, doctor. Look at Brittany. We are about as Caucasian as it gets. You clearly have the wrong file. Go back out to the reception desk and find the actual report for my child." Brittany did not laugh. She remained perfectly still on the examination chair, her previously vacuous smile melting away into a mask of sudden, rigid panic. She stared straight ahead at the blank ultrasound monitor, her manicured fingers gripping the thin paper sheet covering her lap. Patricia immediately went on the offensive, her maternal instincts violently rejecting anything that threatened her curated reality. She lowered her smartphone just enough to glare at the doctor over the top of the screen. "This is entirely unacceptable," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Do you have any idea how much we are paying this clinic for premium exclusive care? To come in here and read some other patient's laboratory results on camera is a complete disgrace. I will be contacting the medical board about this gross incompetence. Richard, call our lawyers immediately." The doctor did not move to leave. He did not apologize for a mix-up. Instead, he gripped the crisp white laboratory report tighter, his knuckles turning white. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, catching the glare of the recessed lighting. He took a deep, steadying breath, bracing himself against the rising tide of the family's indignation. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Blackwell," the doctor stated, his voice devoid of any bedside warmth. "I personally oversaw the processing of these results. The patient identification numbers match perfectly. The blood sample belongs to Brittany." Liam took a threatening step forward, his aggressive sales tactics bleeding into his personal life. "Then your laboratory is broken," Liam growled, pointing a finger at the physician's chest. "Because neither I nor my girlfriend carry any genetic markers for sickle cell. It is biologically impossible. Fix your mistake before I ruin your career." The doctor stood his ground, though his shoulders remained tense. He flipped to the second page of the comprehensive dossier. "As you know, the advanced testing package you specifically requested does not merely screen for basic chromosomal health," he explained, his words precise and clinical. "You opted for the absolute highest tier of genetic sequencing available, which includes a highly detailed ancestral and ethnic DNA breakdown to map out the exact biological heritage of the fetus." The room grew noticeably quieter. The sound of Liam's heavy breathing and the soft hum of the medical equipment suddenly seemed deafening. The doctor looked directly at Liam, his expression grave. "You are entirely correct, Liam. Neither you nor Brittany possess the genetic markers for this trait. However, the autosomal DNA breakdown indicates something else entirely. The biological father of this child contributed a genetic profile that is definitively of African descent." Liam blinked, his face scrunching in absolute confusion as his brain struggled to process the medical jargon. He looked back at Brittany, who was now visibly trembling, her breath hitching in her throat. The doctor lowered the paper, delivering the final crushing blow. The fetus carries precisely 50% African American DNA. A heavy, suffocating vacuum of silence descended upon the VIP suite. It was the kind of absolute stillness that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. The air was sucked out of the room, leaving everyone paralyzed in a state of suspended animation. Patricia's smartphone remained suspended in the air, the recording light blinking a steady, cheerful red, capturing a moment of profound devastation. Richard stood frozen by the tripod, his hand hovering awkwardly near the camera mount. Jason slowly lowered his phone, the stock market completely forgotten, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension. It took exactly 3 seconds for the sheer gravity of the doctor's words to fully penetrate the collective consciousness of the room. The genetic math was undeniable. The biological facts were absolute. Like a synchronized macabre mechanism, every single head in the room began to turn. Liam looked away from the doctor. Patricia lowered her camera. Jason shifted his weight. Richard turned his head. Stephanie, whose face had completely drained of color, slowly pivoted on her heels. Every single pair of eyes bypassed the expensive ultrasound equipment, swept past Brittany's trembling form on the examination chair, and landed squarely on the back corner of the room. They all stared at Jamal. Jamal, Stephanie's husband. The quiet man who always stayed in the background. The man who had been sipping premium champagne just moments ago, trying his best to stay out of his mother-in-law's intrusive family vlog. He was the only African-American person in the room. He was the only African-American person in their entire close-knit social circle. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. No one breathed. No one blinked. The air was thick with the sudden toxic realization of unimaginable betrayal. Stephanie stared at her husband, her eyes wide with a horrific mix of confusion and building agony. Liam stared at his brother-in-law, his jaw slacking as his arrogant facade began to visibly crumble into dust. Jamal stood entirely rigid, pinned against the floral wallpaper by the collective horrified gaze of his wife's entire family. His face was an absolute mask of guilt. His jaw trembled. His fingers, wrapped loosely around the stem of the expensive crystal flute, suddenly went entirely slack. The champagne glass slipped from his grip. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash that echoed through the suite like a gunshot. Shards of sparkling crystal exploded outward, scattering across the pristine white rug. The bubbly golden liquid splashed across Jamal's expensive leather shoes, leaving a dark, spreading stain. The sudden violent noise broke the spell. Brittany let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp. She threw both of her hands over her face, curling inward and shrinking back into the leather examination chair, as if she could somehow disappear into the upholstery. She began to sob, the sound loud and pathetic in the shattered quiet of the room. The horrific truth struck Liam like a runaway freight train, knocking the breath completely out of his lungs. His perfectly crafted world, his supposed ultimate victory, his desperate attempt to secure his wealth and legacy while destroying me. It was all a massive, humiliating illusion. The child he had been boasting about to the entire world was not his. The woman he had destroyed our marriage for, the woman he had flaunted in court just hours ago, had been sleeping with his own brother-in-law. The fragile facade of their flawless, superior family shattered instantly, leaving nothing but ugly, inescapable ruin. For a split second after the glass shattered, no one moved. Then a sound completely devoid of human reason ripped through the sterile clinic air. It was Stephanie. She unleashed a guttural banshee scream that vibrated off the acoustic ceiling panels. Her perfectly ironed facade dissolved into pure, unadulterated rage. Without a single moment of hesitation, she vaulted across the small space between them and lunged directly at Brittany. Her manicured hands turned into claws, bypassing the expensive maternity dress and going straight for the younger woman's scalp. Brittany shrieked in absolute terror, throwing her hands up defensively, but Stephanie was relentless. With a violent yank, Stephanie tore a massive handful of expensive platinum blonde hair extensions right out of Brittany's head. Jamal did not try to stop his wife. He did not try to protect the woman carrying his unborn child. Instead, absolute cowardice took over. He spun on his heels, his expensive shoes slipping wildly on the spilled champagne and broken glass, and made a desperate sprint for the heavy oak door. He just wanted out. He wanted to escape the suffocating reality of his own actions. But Jason, the corporate golden boy, who spent his weekends playing aggressive squash at the country club, intercepted him. Jason let out a furious roar and lunged. He caught Jamal perfectly around the waist, executing a flawless and brutal tackle. The momentum carried both grown men across the room, sending them crashing violently into a state-of-the-art medical supply cart. The impact was deafening. Stainless steel buckled sterile instruments cascaded across the floor, and trays of ultrasound gel and sanitized wipes exploded outward. Jamal cried out in pain as the heavy machinery pinned his leg against the wall, but Jason did not stop. He began throwing blind, furious punches at his brother-in-law, screaming about the utter humiliation Jamal had brought upon their pristine family name. Patricia, entirely abandoning her role as a sophisticated matriarch, was shrieking at the top of her lungs. She dropped her smartphone, letting it clatter against the floorboards, and wildly attempted to wedge herself between her warring children. Richard was uselessly shouting commands that no one heard, his face purple with exertion as he tried to pull Jason off the bloody, groaning form of Jamal. The pristine, luxurious suite was transformed into a chaotic war zone of flying fists, torn hair, and shattered glass. Through all the flying debris and deafening screams, Liam simply stood there. He was entirely paralyzed. His arms hung limply at his sides, his eyes wide and vacant, as he watched his family physically tear each other to pieces. The overwhelming pride he had paraded around the room just 10 minutes earlier had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a deep, suffocating humiliation that pierced him to his very core. He was the man who bragged about his virility. He was the man who proudly flaunted his young, fertile mistress in front of the world. Now he was nothing but a cosmic joke. He was the ultimate fool, standing frozen, while the mother of his supposed heir was being physically assaulted for sleeping with his own sister's husband. His mind simply could not process the absolute devastation of his ego. Dr. Evans had flattened himself against the far wall, his face a mask of professional horror. He scrambled backward toward the hallway, his hands raised defensively as he yelled for his medical staff. Nurses flooded the corridor outside, their eyes widening in shock as they witnessed the violent brawl spilling out from the VIP suite. Someone at the front desk had already slammed the emergency panic button, and the shrill sound of sirens was already piercing through the Boston afternoon. Within minutes, local police officers burst into the clinic. They did not care about the family's wealth, their social standing, or the designer labels they were wearing. They saw an active, violent brawl in a medical facility and acted with immediate, forceful precision. Officers physically pried a screaming, thrashing Stephanie off the weeping Brittany. They dragged Jason away from Jamal, forcing him face down onto the cold tile floor to secure his wrists. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. Wealthy clients and clinic staff lined the hallways with their phones out, recording every pathetic second as the great family was marched out of the building. Stephanie was sobbing hysterically, a torn clump of blonde hair still tightly gripped in her handcuffed hands. Jamal was limping and bleeding from a cut above his eye, flanked by 2 officers. Jason was shouting threats of legal action, his expensive suit ripped at the shoulder. Liam followed them out, completely silent, his head hung low in utter defeat. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the undeniable collapse of his entire world. A world away from the screeching sirens and flashing lights of Boston, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The Scottish Highlands stretched out in a breathtaking panorama of rugged green hills and deep, silent lochs. I stood on the massive stone balcony of the historic estate that the International Medical Research Institute had secured for my arrival. I wrapped a thick woolen shawl tightly around my shoulders, breathing in the crisp, incredibly pure morning air. The wind off the water was sharp and invigorating, completely washing away the suffocating tension I had carried for the past decade. Leo and Lily were safely asleep inside, completely exhausted from the transatlantic flight, dreaming peacefully in their massive new bedrooms. I held my morning coffee in one hand, the warmth seeping into my skin, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound, untouchable peace. I had done it. I had safely navigated my children out of a toxic environment and secured a brilliant future that depended on no one but myself. I pulled my smartphone from the pocket of my coat. Despite having deleted my American cellular plan, I was connected to the estate's high-speed wireless network. The screen illuminated, displaying a staggering barrage of notifications. There were 47 missed calls. Every single one of them was from Liam. Accompanying the calls was a massive wall of frantic, erratic text messages. He was demanding answers. He was begging for explanations. He was unleashing a torrent of panic, trying to reach the one person who had always managed his crises and fixed his mistakes. He had finally realized that the anchor he had so gleefully cut loose was the only thing keeping him from drowning. I did not read a single message. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I stared at his name on the bright screen, feeling absolutely nothing but sweet detachment. With one simple, decisive swipe of my thumb, I navigated to his contact profile. I tapped the red button that read Block Caller. I watched his name vanish into the digital void, permanently erasing his access to my life. I set the phone face down on the stone railing and turned my face toward the rising Scottish sun. Thousands of miles away, sitting in the harsh, uncomfortable holding cell of a Boston police precinct, Liam stared blankly at his own phone screen. The call had failed to connect, sending him straight to a generic automated voicemail. He was bruised, exhausted, and surrounded by the furious, echoing shouts of his arrested family members demanding to be released. He needed thousands of dollars in immediate cash to post bail and hire defense attorneys before the local tabloids caught wind of the scandal. He reached into his pocket for his wallet, completely confident that his premium bank cards would solve this embarrassing mess. He truly believed he could just throw money at the problem, entirely unaware that his absolute worst financial nightmare was only just beginning. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the Boston police precinct buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the cramped processing area. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the undeniable stench of desperation. Liam stood before the heavily scratched plexiglass of the bail desk, shifting his weight painfully. His expensive Italian suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, a souvenir from his brother's wild tackle, and a dark purple bruise was already blossoming along his left cheekbone. Behind him, secure in holding cells, the rest of his family was continuing their spectacular meltdown. Stephanie was still sobbing hysterically, her wails echoing down the concrete corridor, while Jason loudly demanded his personal attorney. Liam knew he had to act fast. If the local press caught even a whisper that the prominent Blackwell family had been hauled out of a VIP maternity clinic in handcuffs following a violent, paternity-induced brawl, the social and professional fallout would be unrecoverable. He stepped up to the metal grate, straightening his ruined tie in a pathetic attempt to salvage his dignity. He projected his usual aura of untouchable arrogance, masking the absolute humiliation churning in his gut. The desk sergeant, a grizzled man who looked entirely unimpressed by Liam's designer clothes, slid a clipboard through the slot. He rattled off the total bail amounts for Stephanie, Jamal, and Jason, adding the standard processing fees with a bored, monotonous drawl. The total was exorbitant, a figure that would make an average citizen physically ill, but Liam barely blinked. This was a minor inconvenience, a transactional hurdle he could effortlessly clear. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his sleek, heavy titanium black card. He slapped it down onto the metal counter with a resounding authoritative clink, sliding it through the gap with a smug, expectant glare. The officer picked up the heavy metal card, turning it over once with a flicker of mild surprise, before inserting the chip into the precinct's battered card terminal. Liam casually leaned against the counter, already formulating his damage control strategy for the inevitable family meeting that would follow their release. He was mentally drafting the non-disclosure agreements he would force Jamal and Brittany to sign. But his calculating thoughts were abruptly derailed by a sharp, violent, and incredibly loud electronic beep. The desk sergeant looked at the screen, then back up at Liam, his expression flattening into mild amusement. "Decline," the officer stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. Liam scoffed, a short, abrasive sound of pure disbelief. He stood up straight, his bruised face flushing with immediate defensive anger. "That is absolutely impossible," Liam snapped, slapping his palm against the counter. "That is an exclusive, unlimited premium account. Your machine is clearly archaic and malfunctioning. Run it again. And run it as credit, not debit, you incompetent fool." The sergeant did not appreciate the insult. His jaw tightened, but he silently withdrew the card, wiped the chip on his uniform shirt, and firmly shoved it back into the terminal. He hit the necessary buttons with exaggerated, forceful precision. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting the exact same sharp, aggressive, rejecting beep. The bright red text flashing across the small digital display was undeniable. "I am not running it a third time, buddy," the officer grunted, sliding the useless piece of metal back through the slot. "You either have another form of payment, or your family is getting comfortable on those steel benches for the night." Next in line, a low murmur of snickers rippled through the small crowd of exhausted public defenders and petty criminals waiting behind Liam. The sheer suffocating embarrassment of the moment felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He snatched the titanium card off the counter, his fingers trembling with a mix of fury and rising, unexplainable panic. He shoved his way out of the line, retreating to a dingy corner near a row of broken vending machines. He pulled out his smartphone, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen, as he dialed the exclusive 24-hour Platinum Concierge line associated with the account. The automated system picked up, and Liam bypassed every menu option, repeatedly pressing 0 while shouting into the receiver. When a live representative finally answered, greeting him with practiced corporate politeness, Liam unleashed a torrent of blind rage. He screamed at the bewildered employee, demanding to be transferred to the highest-level manager on duty. He raged about the public humiliation he was currently enduring, shouting his net worth into the dingy precinct corner and threatening to pull all of his vast imaginary assets from their institution if his card was not unfrozen in the next 60 seconds. "Sir, please calm down," the senior banker interjected, his voice dropping several degrees in temperature, shifting from customer service warmth to a chilling, legalistic coldness. "I am looking at the account matrix right now. I need you to verify your social security number so I can explain the current restriction status." Liam rattled off his numbers, his chest heaving as he paced furiously over the sticky linoleum floor. He waited for the groveling apologies, expecting the banker to frantically reverse whatever ridiculous security flag had frozen his assets. Instead, the response he received shattered his reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. "Thank you for verifying your identity, Mr. Blackwell," the banker stated smoothly. "However, I must inform you that you have no authorization to access or utilize this credit line. You are not and have never been the primary account holder." Liam stopped pacing, the breath hitched in his throat, his bruised face suddenly draining of all color. "What the hell are you talking about?" Liam demanded, his voice dropping to a panicked, breathless whisper. "My name is literally engraved on the metal. I have used this account for the last 8 years. "That is correct," the banker replied, entirely unmoved by Liam's distress. "You were listed as an authorized user on a premium account, established and solely owned by your former spouse, Cassidy Blackwell. According to our system logs, the primary account holder formally revoked your authorized user status and permanently canceled your card at exactly 2:14 this afternoon." The precise timestamp echoed in Liam's mind. 2:14. The exact literal second the judge's gavel had slammed down, finalizing their divorce decree. "She cannot do that," Liam gasped, leaning heavily against the buzzing soda machine as his legs threatened to give out. "My entire financial life is tied to that account. My credit score is immaculate. I demand you reinstate my access immediately." "I am afraid you are fundamentally misunderstanding the situation, sir," the banker clarified, his tone carrying a brutal, unmistakable finality. "You do not have an immaculate credit history. Your impressive credit score, your high spending limits, and your favorable borrowing terms were completely synthetic. They were entirely built on and tethered to Cassidy Blackwell's flawless financial management, her early high-yield investments, and her pristine payment history. By removing you from her profile, your credit score has immediately reverted to its isolated organic state. Without her backing, your independent credit history is virtually non-existent and frankly insufficient to qualify for even our most basic entry-level credit products. The line clicked dead, leaving Liam listening to the hollow, mocking dial tone. The phone slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers. He stared blankly at the dirty precinct floor, the horrifying, unvarnished truth washing over him in a sickening, freezing wave. He had spent years belittling my career, mocking my financial caution, and boasting about his own superior business acumen. He had genuinely believed he was a self-made titan, a wealthy patriarch who had generously allowed me to ride his coattails. But the titanium card in his hand was just a prop. His wealth was a mirage. His perfect credit score, the very foundation of his arrogant, lavish lifestyle, had been nothing more than a temporary costume I had allowed him to wear. He had absolutely nothing. He stood paralyzed in the police station, realizing he could not bail out his cheating family. He could not pay his aggressive lawyers, and he could not fund the lavish life he had promised his deceitful, pregnant mistress. The nightmare was no longer just about public humiliation or a shattered family tree. It was a total, inescapable financial obliteration. Liam stood frozen in the drab, echoing lobby of the police precinct, his breathing shallow and erratic as the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly overhead. He frantically tapped his phone screen, bypassing the useless concierge line and logging directly into his mobile banking application. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity before his digital dashboard finally materialized, displaying a bright red banner that stretched across the top of his screen. Account suspended. He swiped down with desperate trembling speed, uncovering a massive cascade of automated alerts he had previously ignored or arrogant dismissed as clerical errors. Without my pristine financial history acting as his invisible shield, his true, horrifying debt-to-income ratio was fully exposed to the financial world. The algorithms had finally caught up with his lies. An urgent collection notice sat at the very top of his inbox, demanding immediate, full payment for the $50,000 custom sports car he had secretly financed for Brittany just 3 months prior. He had secured that exorbitant loan by leveraging my assets as collateral, quietly forging my digital signature on the application. Now, with the divorce finalized and his access to my capital completely severed, the dealership was initiating aggressive repossession protocols. His checking accounts were entirely frozen, pending a fraud investigation flagging his suddenly plummeted creditworthiness and the unsustainable mountain of debt he had accumulated under the radar. He slowly turned away from the battered plexiglass of the bail desk, his shoulders sagging heavily beneath the ruined fabric of his torn designer suit. He shuffled back toward the waiting area where his parents were anxiously hovering. Patricia and Richard looked up expectantly, waiting for their son to produce the necessary bail bonds to rescue their golden family from the sheer indignity of a police holding cell. Liam swallowed hard, his throat painfully dry as he forced himself to speak the humiliating truth. He admitted that his premium cards were declined, that his accounts were inexplicably locked, and that he did not have a single dollar in liquid cash to his name. Patricia's face contorted in absolute horror, the wealthy matriarch entirely unable to comprehend the concept of insufficient funds. She demanded Richard write a check, her voice echoing shrilly against the concrete walls, but Richard just shook his head in grim defeat. His wealth was tied up in complex corporate trusts and illiquid real estate assets. He had no way to access thousands of dollars in raw cash at 2 a.m. The realization hit them simultaneously. They would have to leave Stephanie and Jamal in those filthy holding cells overnight. When Liam confessed that his credit was a total mirage, the resulting explosion tore a massive, irreparable rift straight through the center of the Blackwell family. Patricia shrieked at Liam, calling him a useless embarrassment, while Richard furiously berated his son for dragging their pristine reputation through the mud. They turned their backs on him in utter disgust, marching out of the precinct into the bitter Boston night, leaving their daughter locked in a cage with her cheating husband, while Liam stood entirely abandoned in the lobby. An ocean away, my reality was painted in entirely different, brilliantly vibrant colors. The morning sun broke through the mild Scottish mist, casting a breathtaking golden glow over the historic cobblestone streets of Glasgow. I walked hand in hand with Leo and Lily, our footsteps echoing softly as we approached the imposing, magnificent wrought iron gates of the Glasgow International Academy. The campus looked like something pulled directly from a classic piece of literature, boasting stunning Gothic architecture, sprawling emerald green lawns, and centuries of academic prestige. My children stared up at the massive stone turrets, in absolute awe, dressed sharply in their new plaid uniforms, their previous anxieties about moving abroad, completely replaced by pure, unadulterated excitement. We spent the morning meeting with the welcoming headmaster, finalizing their enrollment in the advanced placement programs, and touring the expansive art studios and impressive science laboratories. Watching them confidently shake hands with their new teachers, their faces bright with curiosity and joy, solidified every difficult choice I had made over the past 10 months. After dropping them off for their orientation session, I made the short scenic walk to my newly leased workspace. I had secured a top-floor corner suite in a modernized historical building directly overlooking the university campus. The space was absolutely breathtaking. Massive arched windows flooded the room with pure natural northern light, creating the absolute perfect environment for my meticulous profession. I spent the afternoon joyfully unboxing my equipment, carefully setting up my dual high-definition drawing monitors, my specialized digital rendering tablets, and my extensive anatomical reference library. This state-of-the-art medical illustration studio was entirely mine, funded by my own talent and relentless hard work, completely untethered from Liam's toxic, suffocating shadow. I arranged my desk so that whenever I looked up from diagramming complex neurological pathways or cellular structures, I was greeted by the stunning view of the historic city skyline. I was breathing deeply, thinking clearly, and stepping firmly into a brilliant future, brimming with limitless professional and personal potential. Back in the United States, the morning sun illuminated the catastrophic wreckage of the Blackwell family's social standing. Patricia sat in her excessively decorated Beacon Hill kitchen, furiously scrolling through the local digital gossip blogs that had already begun publishing unverified whispers about the violent clinic brawl. Her perfect daughter was facing assault charges, her son was exposed as a broke fraud, and her pretentious country club friends were already sending thinly veiled messages of mock sympathy. Her entire carefully curated world had burned to the ground in less than 24 hours, and she absolutely refused to blame her own children for the matches they had lit. Seething with a desperate, venomous need for a scapegoat, Patricia locked her sights entirely on me. If her son's life was ruined, she decided with bitter, ruthless conviction, then she was going to completely obliterate mine. She pulled out her laptop, her manicured fingers hovering over the keyboard, preparing to launch a devastating, calculated attack directly against my medical illustration career. Patricia slammed her laptop shut, deciding that a digital trail was too impersonal and easily ignored. Destroying a professional reputation required a vocal, authoritative touch. She picked up her smartphone and dialed the corporate headquarters of the prominent American medical publishing house where I had spent the last 7 years building my career. She bypassed the standard reception desk, using her family's social connections to get directly transferred to the chief of human resources. Patricia smoothed her immaculate hair, cleared her throat, and adopted her most devastatingly concerned, faux, sympathetic tone. She introduced herself as my former mother-in-law, claiming she was making this call purely out of a deep moral obligation to the medical community. Patricia began spinning a vicious, entirely fabricated web of deceit. She warned the director that I had suffered a complete mental collapse, implying that my recent work was compromised and that I had a history of stealing proprietary software. She practically purred into the receiver, confidently expecting the HR director to gasp in horror and immediately flag my industry profile as a severe corporate liability. Instead of the shocked, grateful silence, Patricia anticipated a sharp, genuinely amused bark of laughter echoed through the phone speaker. The HR director did not attempt to hide her absolute derision. She cut Patricia off mid-sentence, her tone dripping with professional disdain. The director coldly informed Patricia that my employment record was not just flawless, but it was the absolute benchmark by which the entire department was measured. The publishing house had not fired me, nor had I left under any cloud of suspicion. In fact, the executive board had spent the last 3 months fighting tooth and nail, offering incredibly lucrative retention packages in a desperate bid to keep me. The director then gleefully dropped the ultimate reality check right into Patricia's lap. She informed my former mother-in-law that I had been actively poached by Europe's leading medical institution. The Scottish facility had secured my talents with a historic, record-breaking contract that made my previous American salary look like pocket change. Before Patricia could even form a coherent response, the director suggested that the Blackwell family focus on their own highly publicized legal troubles rather than spreading pathetic, actionable slander, and abruptly disconnected the line. Patricia stood in her pristine kitchen, the dead phone pressed against her ear, completely reeling from the unexpected humiliation. The sheer magnitude of my triumph tasted like ash in her mouth. While she was plotting my downfall, I had ascended to a level of international prestige and wealth that her own arrogant son could never dream of achieving. Across town, miles away from Patricia's seething rage, Liam was barricaded inside the sprawling suburban marital home he had fought so ruthlessly to keep during the divorce settlement. The house was dead quiet, echoing with the hollow reality of his spectacular downfall. He sat at the large kitchen island, pressing a bag of frozen vegetables against his swollen, bruised cheekbone, surrounded by a mountain of past-due utility bills and frantic messages from his defense attorneys. The silence was violently shattered by a series of sharp, aggressive knocks at the front door. Liam jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He assumed it was the local press hunting for a statement about the clinic brawl, or perhaps Brittany crawling back to demand financial support for Jamal's unborn child. He angrily threw the frozen bag onto the granite counter and marched to the entryway, yanking the heavy wooden door open with a scowl. A grim-faced, broad-shouldered process server stood on the porch, looking entirely unimpressed by Liam's designer clothes and bruised face. The man did not ask for a statement. He simply confirmed Liam's legal identity, shoved a thick, heavy stack of manila folders directly into Liam's chest, and walked away without uttering a single word. Liam stumbled back, the heavy door swinging shut behind him as he looked down at the documents. The bold, terrifying black print across the top page practically burned his retinas. It was a formal, expedited foreclosure notice from his primary lending institution. Liam's knees turned to water. He collapsed against the foyer wall, sliding down until he hit the hardwood floor, the legal papers spilling out across his lap. The document spelled out the undeniable, horrifying truth he had managed to keep buried from the divorce attorneys, his parents, and the rest of the world. Years ago, fueled by his trademark arrogance and convinced he was a visionary financial genius, Liam had secretly taken out a massive predatory second mortgage against the estate. He had taken every single cent of that borrowed equity and dumped it into a series of high-risk, highly speculative cryptocurrency investments. He had chased the digital gold rush at its absolute peak, certain he was going to become a billionaire overnight. When the volatile market inevitably crashed, his entire portfolio had evaporated into the digital ether, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a staggering, suffocating debt. He had managed to keep the bank at bay by quietly relying on my substantial, consistent income to cover the exorbitant monthly trace payments. My paychecks had been the only thing masking the bleeding wound of his catastrophic financial failure. With our divorce finalized and my direct deposits permanently severed, the delicate house of cards had instantly collapsed. He had missed 2 consecutive payments, and the bank, sensing his complete lack of liquidity, had moved with ruthless, terrifying speed to seize the asset. The notice explicitly stated he had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the locks were changed and the property was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Before Liam could even process the reality of becoming homeless, the front door violently swung open. Patricia stormed into the foyer, her face flushed a dark, furious red from the humiliating phone call with my former employer. She opened her mouth to scream at Liam about my Scottish contract, but the words died in her throat as Richard's luxury sedan screeched into the driveway right behind her. Richard slammed his car door, marching into the house, waving an itemized invoice from the criminal defense lawyers representing Jason and Stephanie. The exorbitant retainer fees required to keep his siblings out of jail were astronomical. Richard demanded Liam liquidate his assets to cover the family's legal expenses. Patricia demanded to know why Liam had allowed me to outsmart them all. Liam sat on the floor clutching the foreclosure notice, realizing he had absolutely nothing left to give. The fragile loyalty of the Blackwell family instantly evaporated, replaced by blind panic and vicious accusations, as they finally turned on each other, tearing their own family apart as the walls completely closed in. The morning after the precinct disaster, Stephanie Blackwell did not retreat to her sprawling suburban estate to weep behind drawn curtains. The humiliating reality of being locked in a holding cell, wearing a ruined designer dress that smelled of sweat and spilled champagne, had burned away any remaining shred of affection or loyalty she held for her husband. The moment her father grudgingly posted her bail, she bypassed her home entirely and ordered her private driver to take her straight to the financial district. She marched into the glass-walled offices of Boston's most feared and notoriously aggressive matrimonial attorney. Stephanie unleashed a scorched-earth divorce, filing against Jamal. The petition was absolutely vicious, leaving no sordid detail to the imagination, explicitly citing egregious adultery, emotional abuse, and extreme financial recklessness. Armed with her family's remaining legal muscle and fueled by pure vindictive rage, she secured a brutal emergency injunction before the courts even closed for the day. Within hours of the filing, every single bank account bearing Jamal's name, both joint and personal, was completely frozen. His premium credit cards were instantly deactivated. The locks on their primary residence were changed by a private security firm, and his belongings were unceremoniously boxed up and dumped at the edge of the driveway. Jamal, who had spent the last decade comfortably enjoying the luxurious perks of marrying into the Blackwell empire, found himself standing on the cold sidewalk with nothing but the torn, blood-stained clothes on his back, utterly locked out of his own existence. While Jamal was desperately standing outside his former home trying to find a lawyer who would take his calls without an upfront retainer, another disaster was brewing across town. Brittany sat in her cramped, overpriced apartment, staring in horror as a tow truck aggressively hauled away the custom sports car Liam had presented to her just months prior. She had called Liam 42 times since the clinic disaster. Every single call had gone straight to a generic automated voicemail. The horrifying realization had finally dawned on her. The wealthy, sophisticated patriarch she had seduced was a complete financial fraud, and he had permanently abandoned her to deal with his own catastrophic ruin. Brittany was cornered pregnant and rapidly running out of the cash she needed to maintain her lifestyle. The luxury future she had envisioned was evaporating before her eyes. Desperation breeds ruthlessness. Realizing Liam was a dry well with a foreclosed home, she aggressively shifted her crosshairs to the actual biological father of her unborn child. She hired a hungry, aggressive attorney working on contingency and officially filed a massive paternity and child support lawsuit against Jamal. The suit demanded immediate coverage of her exorbitant VIP maternity clinic bills, future living expenses, and retroactive emotional damages, aggressively citing Jamal's deliberate deception and subsequent abandonment. Court documents of this highly explosive nature, especially those involving prominent local figures, rarely stay buried in the archives. A bored court clerk flagged the sensational overlapping filings, and within 24 hours, the local Boston tabloids had their hands on the absolute mother lode of high society gossip. The separate lawsuits painted a complete, undeniable, and utterly grotesque picture of the family's dysfunction. The media rapidly connected the dots between Stephanie's vicious divorce petition, Britney's explosive paternity suit, and the leaked police records from the chaotic arrests at the medical facility. By Thursday morning, the story was plastered across every digital news outlet and morning television broadcast. The headline, High Society Maternity Brawl, dominated the news cycle printed in bold, unavoidable text. The articles detailed every sordid, incestuous detail for the public to consume. A prominent businessman's young mistress secretly impregnated by his own sister's husband, culminating in a violent, destructive physical altercation inside a sterile VIP clinic. The Blackwell name, once synonymous with old money, prestige, elite real estate development, and philanthropic grace, was instantly reduced to a trashy public punchline. Paparazzi camped outside Richard and Patricia's heavily gated estate, thrusting microphones and flashing cameras at their tinted windows every time a vehicle attempted to enter or exit. The family's elite social circle, terrified of being associated with such a spectacular and vulgar scandal, swiftly and brutally cut them off. Their exclusive country club memberships were suddenly suspended, pending board review, and their presence was abruptly uninvited from the upcoming season of charity galas. The humiliation was absolute, inescapable, and permanently etched into public court records. Patricia could no longer show her face at her favorite upscale boutiques without hearing the poorly stifled whispers of the staff, realizing with horrifying clarity that her family's dirty laundry was now the city's favorite entertainment. Through all the initial chaos, Jason had remained arrogantly aloof, convinced he was the righteous defender of the family's honor. He was the golden boy, the successful corporate executive who had heroically stepped in to punish his treacherous brother-in-law. He truly believed his hands were perfectly clean, his violent actions entirely justified by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had uncovered. But the explosive media coverage and the sprawling legal war did not care about his perceived moral high ground. Cornered, broke, facing complete financial annihilation from Stephanie's divorce tactics, and simultaneously drowning under Britney's paternity demands, Jamal decided he was absolutely not going down alone. He retaliated with a massive civil lawsuit directed squarely at Jason. The suit sought millions in damages for aggravated assault battery and subsequent medical trauma, citing the brutal blindside tackle Jason had executed at the clinic. The lawsuit explicitly detailed the injuries Jamal sustained when Jason violently pinned him against the medical machinery, attaching photographic evidence of the bruising and emergency room records. As the official court summons was handed to Jason by a process server, right in the middle of a high-stakes corporate board meeting, the pristine, untouchable corporate armor he had worn his entire life instantly shattered. The favorite son who had always managed to rise above the fray was violently dragged directly into the crossfire. The heavy thud of the legal summons hitting the polished mahogany conference table echoed like a gunshot through the boardroom. Jason stood frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly open, the laser pointer slipping from his suddenly clammy fingers and clattering to the floor. Around him, a dozen high-ranking executives and senior partners stared in absolute stunned silence. The process server offered a sharp, unsmiling nod before turning on his heel and walking out of the glass-walled suite, leaving Jason completely exposed. He attempted a forced, arrogant chuckle, desperately trying to wave the thick stack of papers away as a trivial misunderstanding, but the damage was already done. The firm's chief executive officer, a man who built his empire on pristine public optics and ruthless risk management, did not laugh. He stared at Jason with eyes like chips of flint. The explosive tabloid headlines regarding the high society maternity brawl had already been a topic of nervous whispers near the water coolers, but having a violent civil lawsuit served directly into an executive board meeting was a catastrophic breach of professional decorum. The CEO coldly interrupted Jason's stammering excuses, adjourned the meeting immediately, and ordered Jason to surrender his corporate laptop security badge and company phone. He was placed on an indefinite, unpaid administrative leave, pending a comprehensive internal review, strictly forbidden from contacting any clients or accessing the building. Jason practically sprinted to the elevator, his face burning with a toxic mixture of rage and humiliation. He retreated to his luxury downtown condo, pacing the hardwood floors and downing glasses of scotch, entirely convinced that his brilliant track record would shield him. He assumed the suspension was a mere formality, a temporary slap on the wrist to satisfy the nervous compliance department. He severely underestimated the absolute ruthlessness of corporate self-preservation. The moment the elevator doors had closed behind him, the firm's executive committee triggered an emergency deep dive forensic audit of Jason's entire portfolio. They brought in an elite team of external digital investigators, instructing them to tear through every single email ledger, expense report, and client account associated with his name. The firm merely intended to ensure that Jason's messy, violent personal life had not compromised any of their high-profile client relationships. Instead, they unraveled a sprawling, highly sophisticated, and incredibly brazen web of financial crimes. Working through the night, the forensic accountants discovered glaring anomalies hidden deep within the firm's international transfer logs. They traced millions of dollars that had been systematically siphoned from dormant corporate capital accounts and routed through a complex labyrinth of phantom vendors and dummy limited liability companies. The money trail was deliberately convoluted, designed to evade standard internal audits, but the external investigators relentlessly followed the digital breadcrumbs directly to a series of offshore trusts located in the Cayman Islands. When the legal team finally pierced the veil of those offshore shell companies, the ultimate beneficiary was revealed. It was Liam. During our highly contentious divorce proceedings, Liam had been desperate to project an illusion of vast, untouchable wealth to his mistress, while simultaneously attempting to legally plead poverty to avoid paying me a single cent in alimony or asset division. Jason, acting as the loyal, arrogant enabler, had abused his high-level executive clearance to facilitate the deception. Jason had systematically embezzled corporate funds, funneling the stolen capital into Liam's hidden accounts to artificially inflate his brother's portfolio and actively hide their parents' remaining wealth from judicial discovery. Jason had manipulated the firm's ledgers to protect his brother's fabricated empire, committing egregious wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny in the process. He had gambled his entire career, his freedom, and his firm's capital on the arrogant assumption that he was simply too smart to ever be caught. 3 days after his suspension, Jason received a terse email from Human Resources demanding his presence at the headquarters to finalize his review. He dressed in his sharpest custom suit, applying a generous splash of designer cologne, entirely prepared to demand his job back with a smug, self-righteous speech about family loyalty and unproven allegations. He strutted into the towering glass skyscraper, offering condescending smiles to the receptionists as he was escorted up to the executive suite. But when the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, he did not find a repentant human resources manager waiting to apologize. He walked directly into a meticulously coordinated trap. The CEO sat at the table alongside the firm's general counsel and 2 stern-faced, heavily armed federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. The smug smirk instantly melted from Jason's face, his blood running entirely cold, as the general counsel slid a massive, meticulously documented binder of his embezzled wire transfers across the table. His termination was absolute and immediate. The CEO delivered the killing blow with chilling precision, informing Jason that his equity was completely forfeited. His severance was permanently revoked, and he would never receive a single professional reference from the institution. There would be no quiet resignation, no golden parachute, and absolutely no mercy. The firm was pressing full federal charges to clear their own name. The federal agents stepped forward, calmly reciting his Miranda rights, as they secured heavy steel handcuffs around Jason's wrists. The cold metal biting into his skin shattered the last remaining fragment of his ego. The security guards did not allow him to use the private executive elevator. Instead, They marched Jason directly through the center of the bustling open-plan trading floor. Hundreds of his former subordinates, peers, and rivals stopped dead in their tracks, watching in stunned absolute silence as the arrogant golden boy was paraded through the aisles in restraints. The public humiliation was excruciating, a slow, agonizing walk of shame under the blinding glare of fluorescent lights and the disgusted stares of the financial elite. He was shoved out the revolving glass doors and roughly guided into the back of a waiting federal vehicle, an utterly disgraced white-collar criminal staring down decades in a maximum security prison. With Jason's spectacular, highly televised arrest completely dominating the evening news broadcasts, the Blackwell family's rapid descent from high society royalty to complete undeniable pariahs accelerated into a fatal nosedive. The financial and criminal rot had now publicly infected every single branch of their deeply arrogant family tree. Patricia and Richard sat rigidly in the parlor of their heavily mortgaged estate, watching the news footage of their favorite son being shoved into a police cruiser in absolute horrified silence. The grand illusion of their genetic and social superiority was entirely permanently shattered, setting the stage for the ultimate fatal blow to their perfectly curated social standing. The flashing blue and red lights from the television screen reflected in Patricia's glassy eyes as the broadcast looped Jason's humiliating perp walk. The suffocating reality of their crumbling empire was closing in around them, exacerbated by the relentless, blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras bleeding through the parlor curtains. Patricia abruptly stood up violently, smoothing the wrinkles from her silk skirt, refusing to surrender to the mounting despair. She demanded Richard pull the remaining luxury sedan from the garage. They were not going to cower in their own home like common criminals. They were Blackwells. They would retreat to the only sanctuary they had left, the ultra-exclusive Oakmont Country Club, where the gates were guarded, the champagne was chilled, and the elite insulated their own. Richard silently obeyed, his face pale and drawn. The drive to the club was painfully quiet, the air thick with unspoken panic. As the heavy wrought iron gates of Oakmont loomed in the distance, Patricia visibly relaxed, adjusting her posture to project her trademark aristocratic arrogance. Richard pulled the vehicle up to the gilded entry pedestal and smoothly slid his platinum membership card into the electronic reader. Instead of the familiar, welcoming click and the slow swing of the gates, the machine emitted a harsh, sharp buzz. The card reader flashed a bright, undeniable red. Richard scowled, muttering about technical glitches, and aggressively swiped the card a second time. Another angry red flash. He slammed his hand against the brass intercom button, demanding the attendant open the gate immediately. Patricia sighed in the passenger seat, already preparing a condescending lecture for whichever incompetent staff member was manning the booth. But the gates remained firmly shut. Instead, the heavy side door of the security pavilion opened, and Arthur Sterling, the fiercely protective president of the Oakmont Board of Directors, and a man Richard had golfed with for 20 years, walked out. He was flanked by two broad-shouldered, stone-faced security guards. Arthur did not offer a friendly wave or a sympathetic smile. He stopped on the secure side of the iron gate, looking down at the Blackwell vehicle with an expression of absolute withering disgust. Richard rolled down his window, attempting to summon his usual jovial country club bluster, but Arthur raised a hand to silence him. With several other luxury vehicles lining up behind the Blackwells, trapping them in the driveway, Arthur delivered the fatal social blow with perfectly projected, brutal clarity. He informed Richard that their platinum membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately. Arthur coldly listed the infractions for the growing audience of waiting members to hear. The Blackwell account was shockingly delinquent, with 6 months of severely unpaid dues and outstanding dining tabs. Furthermore, the board had convened an emergency vote at dawn. Between the highly publicized violent brawls at maternity clinics, the freezing of family assets, and Jason's spectacular arrest for federal embezzlement, the Blackwell name had become a toxic radioactive liability. Arthur explicitly stated that Oakmont was an institution of prestige and decorum, not a refuge for common felons and tabloid fodder. He gestured to the security guards, ordering Richard to reverse his vehicle off the private driveway, immediately warning that the local police would be called to escort them away for trespassing if they lingered. The humiliation was absolute. Trapped between the closed iron gates of their former sanctuary and the staring eyes of their former friends idling in the cars behind them, Richard threw the car into reverse. Patricia shrank into the leather upholstery, hiding her face behind her hands as they slowly backed out onto the public street, completely and utterly banished from elite society. They returned to the suffocating silence of their foreclosed estate, the sheer magnitude of their complete social and financial annihilation finally breaking Patricia's fragile grip on reality. But instead of turning her wrath toward her husband's reckless financial mismanagement, Jason's brazen corporate theft, or Liam's spectacular deceit, Patricia's narcissistic mind sought a scapegoat. She paced the length of the darkened parlor, her voice rising to a frantic, delusional pitch. She blamed absolutely everything on my sudden, unapologetic disappearance. In her twisted logic, I was the sole architect of their downfall. If I had simply stayed in my place, continuing to blindly fund Liam's lifestyle with my lucrative medical publishing salary, none of this would have happened. She convinced herself that I had maliciously orchestrated the entire collapse from across the ocean. Desperation completely eclipsed reason. Patricia marched upstairs and stripped off her remaining diamond tennis bracelet, the last piece of jewelry the banks had not yet seized. She shoved it into Richard's hands, demanding he pawn it immediately. They pooled the pathetic remainder of their once vast fortune to hire a disgraced, dangerously unethical international investigator. Their delusion told them that if they could just track me down in Scotland, they could find a way to drag me into a jurisdictional nightmare, extort my newly acquired wealth, and force me to pay the astronomical debts, dragging their family into the abyss. As Patricia frantically plotted my forced return, the front door of the estate groaned open. Liam walked into the foyer looking absolutely unrecognizable. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained, his face shadowed by days of unshaven stubble, and he carried the entirety of his remaining worldly possessions in 3 black plastic garbage bags. The bank had officially locked him out of his marital home, leaving him entirely homeless and destitute. He dropped the heavy bags onto the marble floor and listened to his parents frantically discussing their pathetic scheme to hire a shady lawyer to extort me. A dark, terrifyingly hollow laugh escaped Liam's throat. He looked at his mother and father with dead, predatory eyes. He told them that lawsuits, private investigators, and legal threats were entirely useless against the kind of institutional protection and international prestige I now possessed. The rules of polite society and legal maneuvering had completely failed them. Liam slowly stepped further into the shadows of the parlor, his voice dropping to a chilling, dangerous whisper. He declared that playing by the rules was over. If they wanted my money to save their miserable lives, they could not rely on a courtroom. He was going to execute a far more sinister, desperate plan to rip me out of my untouchable new reality and physically force me back into their grasp. Liam turned his back on the pathetic, weeping spectacle of his parents and walked out into the biting night air, abandoning the foreclosed estate without a single backward glance. His grand, sinister plan required immediate capital, something the Blackwell family no longer possessed, forcing him into a reality he had spent his entire adult life mocking. He hailed a cheap rideshare, directing the driver to a dilapidated neon-lit motel on the extreme outskirts of the city. The room he rented by the hour was a miserable, suffocating concrete box that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. Sitting on the edge of the sagging, stained mattress, he unclasped the heavy platinum Rolex from his wrist. It was a rare, limited-edition timepiece he had smugly purchased during the absolute peak of his cryptocurrency delusion, a physical symbol of the immense wealth he truly believed he was destined to command. The next morning, Liam stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of a dingy strip mall pawn shop, shoving the luxury watch across a scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker, a grizzled man entirely unimpressed by Liam's wrinkled designer suit, offered a completely insulting fraction of the watch's true market value. Liam's jaw clenched, his pride screaming at him to walk away, but his absolute desperation anchored his feet to the linoleum floor. He swallowed his arrogant pride, accepted the lowball cash offer without argument, and grasped the thick stack of bills with white-knuckled intensity. He immediately marched down the street to a local internet cafe, ignoring the sticky keyboard and the suspicious stains on the desk, and purchased the absolute cheapest, most convoluted multi-layover flight to the United Kingdom he could find. The screen of the rented computer glowed in the dim cafe as he finalized the meticulous details of his sinister legal trap. Liam was not flying across the Atlantic to beg for my forgiveness, nor was he fighting for custody out of any sudden paternal love for Leo and Lily. To Liam, his children were entirely useless except as high-value emotional leverage. He was going to weaponize international law. He had spent the last 48 hours in his miserable motel room, obsessively researching the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. His strategy was beautifully malicious in its brutal simplicity. He intended to march directly into a Scottish police precinct and falsely report that I had unlawfully kidnapped our children across international borders without his consent. He would play the role of the devastated, frantic, left-behind father, leveraging the severe, immediate mandates of international child abduction treaties to trigger a massive jurisdictional crisis. He knew the Scottish authorities, bound by strict international treaties, would be legally obligated to investigate the claim immediately. This would instantly disrupt my pristine new life. He pictured the police arriving at my prestigious new medical institution, dragging my name through the mud of the European family courts, and terrifying the executives who had just awarded me a historic contract. Once the international legal machine was tearing my world apart, once I was facing the absolute terror of having my children deported back to a disgraced American father, he would quietly offer a settlement. He would drop the Hague petition legally, sever his parental rights, and grant me full, uncontested international custody, provided I transfer $10 million into an untraceable offshore account. It was pure, unadulterated extortion masked as a desperate, heartbreaking custody battle. The journey to Europe was an agonizing 36-hour ordeal of cheap, budget airlines, cramped middle seats located directly next to the lavatories, and endless layovers in freezing, crowded terminals. Stripped of his usual first-class lounges, priority boarding privileges, and complimentary champagne, Liam seethed with every delayed connection and every inch of lost legroom. He was forced to sleep on hard plastic airport chairs, his expensive suit becoming increasingly rumpled and smelling of stale travel. Yet the intense physical discomfort only sharpened his vindictive focus. He spent the grueling sleepless hours across the Atlantic meticulously rehearsing his victim act. Locked inside the tiny vibrating airplane bathrooms, he stared at his exhausted reflection in the mirror, practicing the exact facial expressions of a traumatized parent. He forced artificial tears to well up in his eyes, perfected the slight, devastated tremor in his voice, and crafted the exact sequence of lies he would feed the foreign magistrates. He reviewed his fabricated timeline over and over, ensuring every fake detail regarding my alleged sudden unauthorized departure was perfectly watertight and undeniable. He had convinced himself that I had somehow forged his signature on the relocation documents, a massive lie he was ready to swear to under penalty of perjury. He was absolutely convinced that his status as an educated, affluent American citizen would allow him to effortlessly manipulate the foreign bureaucracy. He assumed the Scottish police would be intimidated by his sharp suit, mesmerized by his polished corporate vocabulary, and entirely sympathetic to his fabricated plight. He believed they would immediately dispatch a tactical unit to rip my children from my arms and hand them directly to him, asking no questions. His American privilege, he arrogantly believed, was a universal currency that would easily steamroll any local authority attempting to verify his claims. The wheels of the budget airliner finally slammed onto the rain-slicked tarmac of Glasgow Airport, violently jolting Liam awake. He grabbed his single scuffed carry-on bag from the overhead bin, entirely ignoring the exhaustion burning behind his eyes and the stiffness radiating through his joints. As he stepped out of the bustling international terminal and into the freezing gray Scottish drizzle, a dark, predatory smile stretched across his face. He hailed a local cab, sliding into the back seat and gripping the door handle with knuckles white from sheer anticipation. He was thousands of miles away from his ruined, bankrupt life in Boston, armed with a devastating legal weapon specifically designed to destroy everything I had recently built. Liam stared out the window at the passing foreign landscape, absolutely ready to rain hellfire down on my new existence. The taxi navigated the winding historic streets of Glasgow, the relentless Scottish rain streaking the windows as Liam's manic energy continued to violently build. He directed the driver to the Glasgow University Medical Research Centre, an address he had memorized during his frantic sleepless nights in that dismal motel room. When the vehicle finally pulled to a stop before a magnificent ultra-modern glass and steel architectural marvel, Liam practically shoved his last crumpled foreign banknotes at the driver and scrambled out into the freezing downpour. He did not bother to seek shelter. He stood on the pristine plaza, his physical appearance a grotesque, jarring contrast to the elite, sophisticated institution looming before him. The grueling transatlantic flight, the days of sleeping in his clothes, and the sheer toxic stress of his total financial ruin had taken a severe, undeniable toll. He looked entirely disheveled, unhinged, and dangerously erratic. His expensive, bespoke suit was heavily wrinkled, stained, and clinging to his damp frame. His hair was wildly unkempt, hanging in greasy strands across his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting with a feral, desperate intensity. He took a deep, jagged breath, summoning every ounce of his manipulative charm and manufactured victimhood, and aggressively pushed his way through the heavy revolving glass doors. The main lobby of the research center was a cathedral of clinical prestige and quiet authority. High vaulted ceilings, polished white marble floors, and massive digital displays highlighting groundbreaking medical achievements created an atmosphere of hushed academic reverence. Brilliant minds in tailored lab coats and sharp business attire moved purposefully through the expansive, pristine space. Liam shattered that dignified silence instantly and purposefully. He did not approach the sleek circular reception desk with a polite inquiry. Instead, he burst directly into the center of the grand atrium, dropped his scuffed travel bag onto the marble floor with a loud echoing thud, and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He unleashed the fully rehearsed, highly theatrical performance he had meticulously perfected in the airplane lavatory. He cried out with a booming, agonized voice that immediately halted every single conversation in the massive room. He wailed that he was a desperate, heartbroken, left-behind father, pointing frantic, trembling fingers at the bewildered receptionists. He loudly declared to the passing academics and stunned security personnel that a high-ranking executive within their very walls had viciously stolen his children across international borders. He stumbled forward, throwing his weight against the reception counter, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of manufactured agony. He demanded to see me immediately, intentionally shouting my full name so it echoed off the soaring glass walls and reached the upper balconies. The security guards stationed by the main entrance instantly tensed, exchanging wary glances as they began to swiftly close in on his position. But Liam only dialed up his aggressive, chaotic performance. He desperately wanted the audience. He thrived on the escalating spectacle. He began dropping heavy, terrifying legal threats, screaming that I was an international fugitive who had committed a severe federal crime under the strict mandates of the Hague Convention. He pounded his fists violently against the polished stone counter, his voice cracking with faux hysteria as he threatened to summon Interpol, contact the United States Embassy, and bring the full weight of international law enforcement down upon the facility if the administration did not force me down to the lobby that exact second. In his deeply arrogant, twisted mind, the malicious strategy was working flawlessly. He had banked his entire extortion plot on the arrogant assumption that his American privilege and commanding corporate tone would allow him to effortlessly steamroll these foreign academics. He noticed the shocked, horrified expressions of the prominent doctors, researchers, and institutional investors pausing on the sweeping staircases to witness the unfolding disaster. He firmly believed that a highly prestigious conservative European medical institution would be absolutely terrified of a massive public relations nightmare. He was utterly convinced that the sheer mortifying embarrassment of his explosive public meltdown would force my hand. He expected me to rush down the stairs in a blind panic, desperate to quiet him, terrified of losing my lucrative new position and ready to sign over whatever extortion money he demanded just to make the embarrassing spectacle disappear. He continued to scream his false accusations, demanding the immediate return of his children, confidently waiting for his ultimate triumph. The chaotic echoes of Liam's shouting were suddenly cut short by the sharp, authoritative click of expensive heels ringing out from above. The low murmur of the gathered crowd abruptly ceased, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Liam stopped his frantic pacing, wiping a fake tear from his bloodshot eye, and snapped his head upward, following the collective gaze of the stunned lobby. There, standing at the very top of the grand sweeping glass staircase that overlooked the entire atrium, I appeared. I looked absolutely untouchable, radiating a cold, calm power, in a sharp, impeccably tailored executive suit that made his ruined, damp clothing look even more pathetic. But as Liam's predatory grin began to form, anticipating my rapid surrender, it instantly froze on his face. I was not looking down at him with fear, embarrassment, or panic. I was looking at him with absolute clinical disdain. And as Liam's eyes quickly adjusted to the bright overhead lighting, a cold wave of genuine terror finally washed over him. I was not alone. Flanking my sides were two of the most formidable figures in the United Kingdom's legal establishment. To my right stood Alistair Sterling, a top-tier Queen's Counsel barrister, renowned for his ruthless dismantling of high-profile international family law cases. He wore a tailored charcoal gray bespoke suit that served as a jarring, immaculate contrast to Liam's soaked, pathetic state. To my left was the director of the university's elite campus security, accompanied by three broad-shouldered, highly trained officers whose stern, unwavering glares were locked directly onto the trespassing madman, ruining their pristine lobby. I began my descent down the grand, sweeping glass staircase with slow, icy elegance. I did not rush. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of my designer heels against the translucent treads severed the thick tension in the room, acting as a slow, deliberate metronome to Liam's rapidly accelerating panic. I did not break into a run. I did not cower, shrink, or hide my face from the dozens of esteemed medical researchers and hospital administrators gathering on the balconies to witness the commotion. Most importantly, I did not utter a single frantic word of defense. I simply glided down the steps, projecting a portrait of absolute unbothered control. Liam, desperate to regain the upper hand and salvage his rapidly disintegrating extortion plot, doubled down on his chaotic, deeply unhinged performance. He practically hurled his entire weight against the polished marble reception desk, his voice cracking as he resumed his hysterical, theatrical screaming. He pointed a trembling, rain-soaked finger directly at my descending figure, bellowing to the crowd of stunned academics that I was a deceitful fugitive, a monster who had cruelly stolen his beloved children under the cover of darkness. He wailed incessantly about international treaties, aggressively demanding that anyone, immediately contact the American embassy to enforce the strict mandates of the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. He threatened the university board of directors, the bewildered receptionists, and the advancing security team, promising devastating multi-million-dollar lawsuits and massive international media exposure if they did not instantly assist him in reclaiming his supposedly stolen family. He truly believed that creating a catastrophic public scene would break my resolve. He expected me to flush with mortification, to rush forward begging for quiet, terrified of losing my lucrative new position, and willing to pay any ransom just to make the embarrassing spectacle disappear. But as I finally reached the ground floor, stopping a safe, deliberate distance away from his flailing arms, I offered him nothing. I simply folded my hands in front of me, observing his manufactured grief with the detached clinical curiosity of a scientist studying a particularly repulsive, insignificant specimen. I refused to raise my voice. I refused to argue. I denied him the very conflict he desperately needed to legitimize his presence. My suffocating silence acted as a vacuum, relentlessly sucking the oxygen right out of his grand theatrical extortion attempt. Realizing his intimidation tactics were completely failing to provoke a reaction, Liam's desperate booming screams gradually morphed into confused, breathless stammers. The crowd of brilliant academics, initially shocked by his sudden intrusion, now watched him with expressions of profound pity and absolute disgust. He was not a commanding patriarch fighting for his family. He was a soaked, deranged vagrant yelling at a brick wall. As his tirade finally sputtered into a pathetic, wheezing halt, Alistair stepped forward. The distinguished barrister did not stoop to address the ranting, disheveled man. Instead, he calmly bypassed Liam entirely and approached the senior security director and the local Glasgow constables who had just breached the building's side entrance in response to the reception desk's silent panic alarm. Moving with meticulous practiced precision, Alistair unclasped his monogrammed leather briefcase and retrieved a crisp, thick manila folder. He smoothly handed the commanding police officer two impeccably filed, heavily notarized legal documents. The barrister's voice, cultured, authoritative, and completely devoid of emotion, carried effortlessly through the echoing atrium as he dismantled Liam's entire existence. He informed the officers that the frantic, rain-soaked man demanding international extradition was entirely devoid of any legal standing whatsoever. Alistair gracefully tapped the first stack of papers. It was our finalized, legally binding Massachusetts divorce decree. The document explicitly, undeniably proved that Liam had voluntarily, legally, and permanently signed away every single shred of his parental rights. He had not been coerced. He had actively demanded the absolute severance during the divorce proceedings to maliciously dodge paying a single cent of child support, prioritizing his own selfish, insatiable greed over any connection to Leo and Lily. He had traded his own flesh and blood for the illusion of financial freedom, legally rendering himself a complete documented stranger to the very children he was now brazenly claiming had been abducted. The Hague Convention strictly required a breach of existing custody rights. Liam had possessed absolutely none to breach. Before Liam could even attempt to process his monumental failure or formulate a new lie to counter the first devastating revelation, Alistair presented the second document. It was a pre-approved ironclad international restraining order, granted swiftly and without hesitation by the highest levels of the United Kingdom family courts. Anticipating the Blackwell family's vindictive desperation following their catastrophic financial ruin, my legal team had preemptively secured profound, unyielding protections. The thick document comprehensively detailed Liam's extensive history of aggressive financial abuse, his mother's unhinged, dangerous stalking, and his recent pattern of erratic, threatening legal extortion. The court order strictly and explicitly forbade him from coming within 500 yards of my person, my children, my residence, or my place of employment. Alistair smoothly informed the Scottish authorities that the man currently dripping rainwater onto their pristine marble floor was not a victimized father seeking justice, but a documented, highly dangerous stalker, actively violating a severe international court order. The smug, arrogant entitlement that had fueled Liam's transatlantic flight instantly evaporated into the chilled air. The absolute certainty that his American privilege and aggressive corporate bluster would save him shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The remaining color completely drained from his unshaven face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of ashen gray. He stumbled backward, his jaw going slack, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, as the piercing, unmistakable wail of approaching police sirens began to echo violently outside the university's glass walls. The wail of the sirens morphed from a distant, indistinct echo into a deafening, immediate roar as two marked squad cars aggressively breached the research center's main plaza. Their tires gripped the wet pavement. With a harsh screech, the flashing blue lights casting frantic, rhythmic shadows through the soaring glass facade. Heavy boots slammed onto the concrete outside, and seconds later, 4 officers from Police Scotland strode purposefully through the revolving doors. Their high-visibility jackets and stern, unyielding expressions instantly commanded the massive, hushed atrium. The sheer physical reality of their presence snapped Liam out of his mute, open-mouthed paralysis. However, instead of exhibiting a shred of remorse or surrendering to the inevitable consequences of his actions, his deeply ingrained toxic entitlement flared into a final spectacular blaze of panic. He violently rejected the reality of his situation. Taking an aggressive, staggering step toward the advancing officers, Liam began to curse wildly, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking, rain-soaked finger at their chests. He loudly invoked his rights as an American citizen, screaming that they possessed absolutely no jurisdiction over a man of his supposed international stature. He demanded immediate contact with the United States Embassy, threatening the officers with catastrophic international lawsuits, civil rights violations, and career-ending diplomatic sanctions. He puffed out his chest, desperately attempting to project the aura of a powerful, untouchable corporate titan, bellowing that his influential family would bury the entire precinct in legal hellfire for daring to interrupt his parental rights. He cursed the elite security guards who had corralled him. He cursed the wide-eyed receptionists huddling behind their desk, and he swore that every single academic observing the scene would pay dearly for this insulting inconvenience. The Scottish constables were entirely unimpressed by the chaotic display of foreign arrogance. They did not slow their deliberate pace, nor did they entertain a single syllable of his frantic, entitled bluster. They operated with a swift, highly coordinated, and brutally efficient professionalism. Before Liam could unleash another empty, ridiculous threat about his American privilege, the two lead officers closed the distance. They seized his flailing arms with unbending strength, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the polished stone edge of the reception desk. Liam gasped, his cheek pressed hard against the cold, unforgiving marble as the commanding officer spoke in a thick, unwavering brogue. He formally placed Liam under arrest, his voice cutting through the chaotic shouting with rhythmic, absolute finality. The charges were listed loud enough for the entire gallery of prominent researchers to hear: severe breach of the peace, aggressive trespassing on private institutional property, and the gross documented violation of a high-level international restraining order. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists severed the very last thread of his grand illusion. That single defining sound shattered his massive ego entirely. The frantic adrenaline instantly drained from his veins, leaving behind a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He was not an untouchable billionaire commanding an empire. He was a completely bankrupt, disgraced, and homeless vagrant, being forcibly detained in a foreign criminal justice system with absolutely no one coming to save him. His parents were destitute, his firm had disowned him, and his grand extortion plot had evaporated into thin air. The sheer weight of his spectacular, irreversible failure finally crushed his legs. As the officers pulled him back from the desk, Liam physically collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the center of the immaculate lobby, his soaked, ruined suit pooling pathetically around him on the floor. The arrogant tyrant completely vanished, replaced by a hyperventilating shell of a man. He began to sob hysterically, releasing loud, wet-heaving gasps that tore through his chest and echoed humiliatingly off the glass walls. He writhed against the firm grip of the constables, twisting his neck to look up at the staircase. He completely abandoned his aggressive demands and resorted to outright shameful begging. The tears streamed down his face, mixing with the rainwater and sweat, as he pleaded with me to call off the barristers and the police. He cried out that he had absolutely nothing left, confessing loudly that the banks had seized his home, his luxury cars, and his entire life. He begged me to save him, his voice reducing to a desperate, high-pitched whine that made the observing academics recoil in disgust. He offered to sign away whatever I wanted, promising to disappear forever, to permanently relinquish any phantom claim to the children if I would just write him a check. He pleaded for a cheap commercial flight back to Boston, for enough cash to secure a miserable apartment for me to fix the catastrophic mess he had made of his own existence. He groveled on the wet marble, a thoroughly broken man, willing to trade every last ounce of his dignity for a fraction of the wealth I now commanded. I watched the pathetic spectacle from my elevated vantage point, completely unmoved by the dramatic display of tears and desperate, empty apologies. I slowly descended the final few steps of the grand staircase, the sharp, deliberate click of my heels serving as the only response to his hysterical wailing. The entire lobby held its collective breath, watching the culmination of his ruin. I stopped just out of his reach, standing perfectly still alongside my legal counsel and the security director. I looked down at the weeping, handcuffed man who had spent years systematically trying to destroy my self-worth and subjugate my ambition. My posture remained flawless, my expression a mask of absolute clinical composure. "You forgot your own rule, Liam," I said, my voice perfectly calm, carrying effortlessly through the hushed, captivated atrium. "Failures don't get a voice here." The Scottish constables did not allow him a single moment to process the absolute finality of my words. They hauled his dead weight off the polished marble floor with practiced, unyielding force, ignoring his breathless, pathetic whimpers. His expensive bespoke suit, now completely ruined and reeking of damp wool and nervous sweat, dripped a pathetic trail of rainwater as they dragged him backward through the grand revolving glass doors. He was shoved roughly into the back of a waiting police cruiser, the heavy wire mesh separating him from the officers, who ignored his frantic, continuing pleas for diplomatic intervention. He spent the night shivering uncontrollably in a grim, sterile holding cell at a local Glasgow precinct. Stripped of his leather belt, his designer shoelaces, and whatever microscopic fragments remained of his manufactured dignity, Liam was forced to sober up to the terrifying concrete reality of foreign incarceration. There were no highly paid corporate defense attorneys rushing through the precinct doors to orchestrate his release. There were no frantic commanding phone calls from his father to bribe the local magistrates, and there was absolutely no room for his usual brand of arrogant manipulation. The Scottish judicial system processed his blatant, documented violation of an international court order with brutal, uncompromising efficiency. By the first light of dawn, he was marched out of the holding cell in heavy steel handcuffs, flanked tightly by two severe immigration enforcement officers. They did not afford him the luxury of hearing a drawn-out legal battle or a chance to plead his fabricated case to a sympathetic judge. He was summarily and aggressively expelled from the country. At the airport, a stern-faced border official heavily stamped his passport with a bold, permanent, and entirely irrevocable ban from entering the United Kingdom. He was unceremoniously shoved into the very back row of a budget commercial airliner, trapped between the loud, foul-smelling lavatory and a screaming infant for a grueling transatlantic flight back to the smoldering wreckage of his former life. Stripped of his usual first-class lounges, priority boarding privileges, and complimentary champagne, he spent the agonizing flight staring blankly at the plastic seatback in front of him, physically and mentally deteriorating with every passing mile. When the aircraft finally touched down at Logan International Airport, Liam was an entirely broken shell of a human being. He navigated the sprawling customs line like a hollow, drifting apparition, his eyes bloodshot and vacant, his posture severely slumped under the crushing, undeniable weight of his monumental defeat. He possessed no luggage, no credit cards that had not already been aggressively declined, and barely enough pocket change to secure a subway ticket back to his miserable motel room. He stepped out of the automatic sliding doors of the terminal and into the harsh, biting Boston wind, wrapping his arms around his shivering torso to ward off the chill. He did not even make it to the taxi rank. A man in a nondescript gray jacket, who had been leaning casually against a concrete pillar, suddenly stepped directly into his path. Before Liam could even attempt to sidestep the stranger, the man firmly slapped a massive, heavily bound stack of legal documents squarely against his chest. The heavy, solid thud knocked the remaining breath directly from Liam's lungs. The man offered a sharp, sarcastic grin, loudly stating that Liam had been successfully served before vanishing seamlessly back into the bustling, noisy crowd of travelers. Liam stumbled backward against the thick terminal window, his trembling hands gripping the massive binder. It was a vicious ironclad civil lawsuit filed by the luxury auto dealership. They were coming after him for the immediate total repayment of the $50,000 debt attached to Brittany's custom sports car, complete with astronomical late fees, aggressive legal penalties, and threats of wage garnishment. The sheer suffocating panic of the impending inescapable financial ruin was instantly eclipsed by a sharp unified chorus of notification chimes erupting from the smartphones of several travelers waiting at the nearby curb. Liam glanced up, deeply disoriented, just as a passing commuter did a double-take, looking from his glowing screen directly to Liam's haggard, unshaven face. The man whispered excitedly to his companion, pointing openly and unapologetically at Liam. A sickening icy knot formed in the pit of Liam's empty stomach. He fumbled in his pocket, retrieving his own cracked mobile device, powering it on, for the first time since his spectacular arrest in Scotland. His inbox and social media feeds were completely inundated, flashing with a synchronized catastrophic explosion of breaking news alerts. Brittany had delivered the ultimate fatal strike. Desperate to escape the crushing liability of the unpaid car loan, and deeply infuriated by the Blackwell family's complete financial implosion, she had ruthlessly monetized their grotesque reality. When the bank accounts froze and the lavish gifts abruptly stopped, Brittany realized her golden ticket had expired. Instead of going down with the sinking ship, she had contacted a massive, ruthlessly aggressive national tabloid syndicate and brokered a highly lucrative exclusive deal. For a massive cash payout designed to instantly clear her crippling debts and secure her own comfortable survival, Brittany had sold the completely uncensored, unvarnished story of the Blackwell family's deeply twisted, incestuous love triangle. Liam stared at his cracked screen in absolute paralyzing horror as the digital headline materialized in bold, unforgiving, crimson letters. The sprawling multi-page exposé left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Brittany had provided the journalists with a treasure trove of damning, undeniable evidence detailing exactly how both Blackwell brothers had been simultaneously funding her lavish lifestyle while deceiving their wives. She held nothing back, explicitly exposing Jason's embezzlement schemes, Liam's fake corporate retreats, and the toxic enabling behavior of Patricia and Richard that had fostered the entire disaster. The journalists had expertly verified every single salacious claim, digging deep into public records to corroborate the timeline of the brothers' dual betrayal. But the killing blow, the absolute centerpiece of the entire sensational publication, was the official unredacted police report from the violent, screaming brawl at the elite maternity clinic. The tabloid featured high-resolution, wildly unflattering photographs of the chaotic scene alongside direct quotes from the responding officers, detailing the exact moment the brothers realized they had both been sleeping with the same pregnant mistress. The explosive article was rapidly going viral, trending globally and permanently cementing the Blackwell name as a national punchline. The digital wildfire sparked by the tabloid article consumed the Blackwell family's remaining shreds of dignity within hours. It was not merely a passing local scandal. It became a sensational, statewide phenomenon. The sheer grotesque absurdity of two supposedly elite affluent brothers unknowingly sharing the same pregnant mistress and the subsequent violent, highly public brawl in a high-end maternity clinic was too irresistible for the internet to ignore. Memes featuring Liam and Jason's bruised, enraged faces from the police reports flooded social media platforms, shared by thousands of mocking strangers. Morning radio hosts dedicated entire drive time segments to dissecting their spectacular downfall, joyfully dubbing them the bumbling Blackwells. Patricia, who had spent decades meticulously cultivating an aura of untouchable aristocratic grace, found her pristine reputation instantly and permanently incinerated. She was unceremoniously expelled from her elite country club via a terse two-sentence email. Her so-called lifelong friends immediately blocked her calls actively, turning their backs and rushing down different grocery store aisles to avoid making eye contact with her. Richard, once viewed as a commanding titan of local real estate, became entirely radioactive. His remaining business associates severed all ties overnight, refusing to return his desperate voicemails, terrified that the toxic lingering stench of the family's public humiliation would somehow contaminate their own enterprises. They were no longer the envy of Massachusetts. They were its absolute, undisputed laughingstock. The public humiliation was merely the agonizing psychological prelude to their ultimate physical ruin. The relentless hemorrhaging of their finances finally reached its terminal, inescapable conclusion. Drowning in Jason's massive court-ordered restitution payments, Liam's multiplying civil lawsuits, and Richard's catastrophic business defaults, the family was officially legally bankrupted. The bank swiftly foreclosed on the sweeping, manicured suburban estate that had served as the physical monument to their arrogance for 30 years. When the county sheriff arrived to enforce the final eviction notice, there were no professional moving trucks waiting to transport their possessions to another luxury property. The court had meticulously seized almost everything of value, including artwork, jewelry, vehicles, and designer furniture, to satisfy their monumental, insurmountable debts. Liam, Richard, and Patricia were reduced to shoving their few remaining non-itemized belongings into heavy-duty black trash bags. Stripped of their matching luggage sets, their pride, and their generational wealth, they loaded the plastic sacks into the trunk of a battered, sputtering 15-year-old sedan Richard had managed to acquire for a few $100s in cash. With zero credit, zero income, and their faces instantly recognizable to any reputable landlord in the state, they were forcefully exiled from the affluent suburbs. They drove in suffocating, miserable silence to the absolute furthest outskirts of the city, pulling into a cramped, deeply depressing trailer park that bordered a noisy industrial highway. Their new residence was a rusted, single-wide aluminum tin can that smelled perpetually of damp rot mildew and stale cigarette smoke. The peeling, yellowed linoleum floors bowed dangerously under their feet, and the rattling window air conditioning unit barely functioned against the oppressive, stagnant heat. Patricia, a woman who had once hosted lavish catered galas in a marble-floored dining room, now sat on a stained second-hand sofa that smelled of dog hair, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling panels. Liam huddled in a claustrophobic, windowless corner of the narrow hallway, his once impeccable tailored suits replaced by unwashed, oversized sweatpants. He was entirely paralyzed by the totality of his defeat, staring vacantly at the scuffed wall. They were trapped in a squalid, inescapable purgatory of their own making, suffocating in the tight quarters alongside the constant, deafening roar of 18-wheeler diesel trucks passing on the nearby interstate. Across the Atlantic, a vivid, brilliant contrast unfolded in the grand, sweeping lecture hall of a prestigious medical university in Geneva. The air was cool, sophisticated, and thrumming with intense academic anticipation. I stood perfectly poised at the center of a brilliantly illuminated stage, dressed in a sharp, tailored emerald suit that commanded absolute authority. Behind me, a massive high-definition digital screen displayed my latest groundbreaking medical illustrations. I guided an audience of over 500 elite international surgeons, research directors, and medical innovators through the intricate, revolutionary vascular mapping techniques I had developed over the past year. My voice was clear, confident, and deeply resonant, entirely unburdened by the miserable ghosts of my past or the pathetic men who had tried to silence me. As I concluded the final slide, highlighting a visual methodology that the university dean had already declared would soon become the global standard in surgical textbooks, a profound, awestruck silence hung in the auditorium for a fraction of a second. Then the entire room erupted. The applause started in the front rows and cascaded upward to the highest balconies, transforming into a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. Esteemed professionals rose to their feet, honoring my work, my intellect, and my undeniable contribution to the medical field. I offered a gracious, poised nod to the crowd, radiating a serene, untouchable triumph. I had not merely survived the Blackwell family, I had transcended them entirely, building an empire of my own brilliance, while they rotted in the ashes of their greed. Back in the suffocating gloom of the rusted trailer, the inescapable reality of their squalor was driving Patricia to the absolute brink of madness. The incessant rhythmic dripping of a leaky kitchen faucet echoed like a ticking clock in the cramped space, measuring the agonizing seconds of her ruined life. She watched Richard aimlessly stare out the smudged, cracked window at a patch of dead weeds, and she listened to Liam's shallow, defeated breathing from the hallway. The crushing weight of their absolute poverty and the searing, agonizing memory of her lost aristocratic status finally shattered the very last remnants of her rational mind. She could not accept this filthy, humiliating existence. She absolutely refused to die in a highly flammable tin box on the side of a polluted highway. Trembling with a toxic, volatile cocktail of total defeat and desperate malice, Patricia forcefully pushed herself off the stained sofa cushions. She rummaged frantically through her worn, scuffed purse, her once manicured nails now chipped and jagged, and pulled out a cheap, prepaid mobile phone. She stared down at the glowing digital keypad, her breath hitching sharply in her chest, as she prepared to make one final, terrifyingly desperate move. The glow of the cheap, prepaid smartphone screen cast a sickly, bluish pallor over Patricia's deeply lined face as she sat hunched on the edge of the sagging trailer sofa. Her thumbs, stiff and unaccustomed to the tiny, unresponsive digital keyboard, began to tap frantically. The leaking faucet in the cramped kitchen continued its maddening rhythm, but she tuned it out entirely, consumed by a sudden feverish surge of manic energy. She was not drafting a brief message, she was composing a sprawling, unhinged 5-page digital manifesto. In her fractured mind, this email was her ultimate salvation, the definitive stroke of diplomatic genius that would rescue her family from this squalid, diesel-fumed purgatory. She addressed the massive block of text directly to the woman who had effortlessly engineered their total destruction. For hours, Patricia sat in the suffocating dampness of the tin box, her breathing ragged as she poured every ounce of her twisted psychology into the glowing screen. Even at absolute rock bottom, entirely stripped of her wealth, her home, and her social standing, she vehemently refused to accept a single shred of accountability. Her email was a masterclass in profound, impenetrable delusion. She meticulously painted herself, Richard, and her disgraced sons as the tragic, innocent victims of a cruel and unforgiving universe. She aggressively shifted the blame for their catastrophic downfall onto everyone else, crafting a highly fictionalized narrative where the Blackwell family had been unfairly targeted by malicious outside forces. She dedicated entire rambling paragraphs to utterly vilifying Brittany. Patricia furiously typed that the young woman was a calculating, predatory seductress who had intentionally and maliciously ensnared her innocent, naive sons. She claimed that Brittany had weaponized her pregnancy to tear their close-knit family apart, framing Liam and Jason as helpless casualties of a devious, home-wrecking tramp who had exploited their generous natures. Then her digital venom pivoted sharply toward Jamal. She venomously accused him of orchestrating an unprovoked illegal financial assault, claiming he was a vindictive thug who had somehow tricked the judicial system into seizing their rightful assets. She ranted that the courts were biased, that the American economy was rigged against true aristocratic legacies, and that their current humiliating bankruptcy was nothing more than a temporary, deeply unjust fluke of bad luck. Her thumbs cramped, but she pushed through the pain, her eyes wide and feverish in the dim light of the trailer. After thoroughly establishing her family's manufactured victimhood, the tone of the massive email abruptly shifted. The aggressive, righteous anger melted away, replaced by a grotesque, nauseatingly sweet brand of manipulation. Patricia transitioned into the plea. She swallowed the very last microscopic fragments of her pride and began to beg. She groveled through the digital text, pleading for a direct international wire transfer. She explicitly detailed the horrors of the trailer park, describing the smell of the damp rot, the terrifying noise of the highway, and the sheer physical agony of watching her formerly powerful husband and son reduced to wearing unwashed sweatpants and a tin can. She weaponized her despair, desperately attempting to strike a chord of pity in the woman she had spent years relentlessly torturing. Then came the ultimate sickening manipulation. Patricia deployed the heavy, suffocating artillery of familial guilt. She typed out phrases dripping with manufactured affection and desperate entitlement. She reminded her former daughter-in-law of the holidays they had shared, completely erasing the memory of her own relentless emotional abuse. She pleaded that deep down, despite the misunderstandings and the unfortunate legal battles, they were still family. She wrote that blood and history tied them together in ways that could not simply be erased by a judge's gavel. Her final sentences were a crescendo of pure, unadulterated begging. She highlighted the stark, undeniable contrast in their current circumstances, typing with frantic desperation, "You have so much now, and we have nothing. Please save us." She promised that if a sum of money were quietly transferred into a new, untraceable account, the Blackwells would completely disappear. They would never bother her again. They just needed a fraction of her newly acquired European wealth to escape the trailer park and secure a modest, dignified apartment. Patricia's hand shook as she read over the massive, disjointed block of text one final time. Convinced of its brilliance, she hit send, dropping the prepaid phone onto the stained cushion and exhaling a long, trembling breath into the stagnant air. She genuinely believed it would work. She believed the guilt would finally take root. 4,000 miles away, the morning sun was just beginning to cast a brilliant golden glow over the vibrant city of Glasgow. The air was crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of the suffocating desperation that choked the Massachusetts trailer park. I was sitting at a sleek, polished obsidian dining table in the center of my immaculate, ultra-modern luxury penthouse. The expansive, open-concept living space featured massive floor-to-ceiling acoustic glass windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view overlooking the shimmering expanse of the River Clyde. I held a steaming cup of artisanal espresso, dressed in a soft, luxurious silk robe, enjoying the profound, uninterrupted tranquility of my sanctuary. There were no leaking faucets, no roaring diesel trucks, and no toxic whispers of manipulation. A soft, elegant chime echoed through the quiet penthouse, breaking the morning silence. I set my ceramic cup down on the polished stone and reached for my sleek silver tablet resting nearby. The screen illuminated, displaying a new notification in my private, heavily filtered personal inbox. I unlocked the device with a casual swipe of my finger, my eyes scanning the sender's name. A slow, bemused smile touched the corners of my mouth as I opened the sprawling, manic 5-page email from Patricia. I read through the frantic, disjointed paragraphs of Patricia's delusion with absolute chilling detachment. I did not feel a single shred of pity, nor did I feel the burning, impulsive need to draft a fiery emotional rebuttal to her profound insanity. Replying with anger or justification was a luxury I absolutely refused to grant them. They no longer merited my emotional labor or my time. Instead, I calmly tapped the screen of my tablet and forwarded the entire unhinged manifesto directly to Jamal and my international legal team. Within the hour, my attorneys had coordinated a precise, surgically efficient response. I would not engage in a messy, protracted email chain that Patricia could somehow twist, commodify, or manipulate for her own victim narrative. I would establish an irrevocable, legally recorded boundary. My lawyers sent a single, sterile digital invitation to Patricia's prepaid phone for a heavily monitored video conference. The attached stipulations were absolute and unyielding. The call was strictly for the purpose of formalizing a permanent international no-contact order, and it would be recorded for jurisdictional enforcement by the authorities. There would be no negotiation and no debate. At precisely 2 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, I sat behind my massive polished obsidian desk and tapped the connection link. The digital window opened, splitting my high-definition monitor, and the visual contrast that filled the screen was nothing short of staggering. In the lower quadrant of my display, the feed from Patricia's cheap device materialized, grainy, lagging, and heavily pixelated. They were huddled together in the oppressive, suffocating gloom of their narrow aluminum trailer. The harsh, sickly yellow light from a single bare bulb illuminated the peeling, nicotine-stained wall paneling and the cracked, shattered plastic casing of the phone they were desperately sharing. Patricia looked severely haggard, her skin sallow and her eyes wild with feverish, unchecked desperation. Liam hovered directly over her shoulder, a hollowed-out physical ghost of the arrogant corporate executive he had once pretended to be. His face was heavily shadowed by an unkempt beard, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, and his posture was entirely crushed beneath a stained, oversized gray t-shirt. They stared through their shattered glass screen directly into my reality. My high-resolution camera broadcasted a life they could barely even comprehend. The sun-drenched Glasgow penthouse was bathed in brilliant natural light streaming through the massive acoustic glass windows. Behind my immaculate posture, the sweeping, open-concept living space extended into a stunning, cloudless panorama of the River Clyde. But the most devastating element of my broadcast was not the expensive modern art adorning the walls or the bespoke Italian furniture resting on the gleaming hardwood floors. It was the soft, joyful melody drifting through the pristine air. Sitting together on the polished leather bench of a magnificent ebony Steinway grand piano were Leo and Lily. My beautiful, vibrant twins were healthy, thriving, and completely radiant. They were dressed in immaculate soft cashmere, laughing brightly with one another as their small fingers clumsily pressed the ivory keys, surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute peace, boundless opportunity, and unconditional love. They were the physical embodiment of a magnificent future the Blackwells would never ever touch. The moment Liam's sunken eyes registered the piano, the brilliant sunlight and the beautiful, happy children he had ruthlessly discarded, something inside his fragile psyche fundamentally and violently snapped. The thin facade of numb shock he had worn since his unceremonious deportation instantly dissolved into raw, agonizing devastation. The crushing weight of his catastrophic decisions finally crashed down upon him all at once. He brought his trembling, unwashed hands to his face and burst into loud, ragged sobs. The cheap microphone picked up the pathetic guttural sound of a broken man weeping for the monumental, irreversible destruction of his own life. He wept for the brilliant children who did not even know his name, the devoted, highly successful wife he had betrayed, and the magnificent, privileged future he had traded for a squalid, pathetic lie. He collapsed completely out of the camera's frame, his heavy weeping echoing miserably off the thin aluminum walls of their trailer. Patricia, completely ignoring her son's total psychological collapse, pressed her face closer to the cracked screen. She began to beg. Her voice was shrill and frantic, offering empty promises, claiming she had always loved me like a true daughter, and pleading for just a tiny fraction of my immense wealth to save them from starvation and ruin. I did not interrupt her frantic, groveling monologue. I did not hurl insults, roll my eyes, or mock their filthy, cramped surroundings. I simply sat there, my posture flawlessly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute professional detachment. I let the crushing, heavy silence of my unbothered existence answer her desperate pleas. The complete absence of my anger was far more terrifying to Patricia than any screaming match could have ever been. My cold clinical observation reduced her to exactly what she was: an insignificant, irrelevant stranger begging for scraps from a woman she could no longer hurt. As her frantic pleas eventually sputtered into breathless, pathetic gasps, the suffocating silence stretched endlessly between our two drastically different worlds, monitored quietly by the silent legal representatives on the call. I finally leaned forward, my gaze locking directly onto the camera lens, preparing to deliver the absolute, irrevocable final words they would ever hear from me. I let the silence hang for another calculated second, ensuring the absolute finality of the moment settled heavily upon them. Before Patricia could launch into another round of fabricated apologies, a sudden scuffle erupted in the dim background of their feed. Liam lunged forward, physically shoving his mother aside, so that his haggard, tear-streaked face entirely filled their cracked screen. He was panting, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He began to babble, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a pathetic, disjointed rush. He begged for forgiveness, swearing that he had been out of his mind during the entirety of our marriage, claiming that the immense pressure of his father's expectations had driven him to make terrible, irrational choices. He promised he had changed, that the squalor of his current existence had forcefully awakened him to the profound reality of what he had lost. He pleaded for just one more chance, one single opportunity to prove he could be the husband and the father that I had always deserved. It was a grotesque, groveling display, stripping away the very last illusion of the powerful, commanding executive I had once thought I married. I did not interrupt his pathetic rambling. I watched him unravel with the clinical, detached observation of a scientist examining a deeply flawed specimen under a microscope. When his voice finally cracked and he descended into heavy, breathless sobbing, I slowly leaned forward, bringing my face close to the high-definition camera. My posture was perfectly serene, my breathing even, and my expression entirely unburdened. I did not raise my voice, nor did I inject a single ounce of malice into my tone. "I am not angry at you," I said, my voice cutting through the digital static with crystalline, undeniable clarity. "You were just a stress test I had to pass. Thank you for making me sign those divorce papers. Setting me free was the only useful thing this family ever did." The sheer freezing weight of my calm delivery struck them with the force of a physical blow. Liam's jaw dropped, his sobbing instantly silenced by the profound realization that my emotional well had completely run dry. Patricia stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, finally grasping the absolute terrifying truth that no amount of manipulation, guilt, or begging would ever bridge the monumental chasm between us. I had not just closed the door on the Blackwell family. I had sealed it in concrete and walked away without a backward glance. Without waiting for a response, I reached out and firmly clicked the button to end the transmission. The pixelated image of their squalid trailer vanished instantly, replaced by the sleek, elegant reflection of my own serene face on the black monitor. I immediately turned to the secondary screen, where my legal and digital security teams were waiting on standby. With a few swift, decisive keystrokes, I authorized the permanent termination protocol. Their IP addresses were universally and irreversibly blocked across all my personal and professional networks. Any future emails, phone calls, or digital attempts to reach out would be silently and automatically routed to a dead-end, unmonitored server. The severance was absolute, legally binding, and completely permanent. I stood up from my obsidian desk, walking toward the expansive glass windows. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the pristine Scottish air, feeling an extraordinary, weightless liberation wash over my entire soul. The Blackwells were finally truly erased from my universe. 6 months later, the crisp evening air of Geneva was illuminated by the brilliant, sweeping spotlights of a grand, highly anticipated inauguration. I stood at the pinnacle of the sweeping marble staircase leading to the newly constructed Vance Institute for Advanced Surgical Mapping. The architectural marvel, a glittering fusion of glass, steel, and cutting-edge technology, was entirely funded by the massive global success of my proprietary medical software. The courtyard below was filled with an elite international crowd of brilliant minds, from pioneering neurosurgeons to wealthy philanthropists who had eagerly backed my vision. Cameras flashed brilliantly as I stepped forward to the podium, dressed in a breathtaking, custom-tailored evening gown that radiated absolute power and grace. To my right, standing proudly alongside my lead investors, were Leo and Lily. They looked absolutely magnificent, their eyes shining with bright, uninhibited joy as they watched their mother command the attention of the global medical community. They were surrounded by brilliant mentors, unwavering support, and a life entirely insulated from the toxic, destructive greed that had almost consumed us. As I raised the ceremonial golden scissors to cut the wide silk ribbon stretched across the Institute's grand entrance, a profound, undeniable sense of victory settled deeply into my bones. I was a wealthy, fiercely independent, and entirely victorious woman. I had navigated the absolute darkest, most treacherous depths of betrayal, deception, and psychological warfare, and I had emerged completely forged in fire. As the heavy silk ribbon fell away and the crowd erupted into a deafening, joyous chorus of applause, I smiled, realizing the absolute beautiful truth of my journey. The ultimate revenge against the people who had tried to bury me was never about stooping to their level or actively orchestrating their destruction. The true lasting victory was simply letting them burn themselves to the ground with their own greed, while I ascended to heights they could not even begin to comprehend. I had won by thriving. Have you ever realized that the worst thing to happen to you was actually your greatest liberation? Share your story of cutting off toxic people in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe for more. The most profound lesson from Cassidy's journey is that true vindication does not come from destroying those who wronged you, but from completely outgrowing them. When faced with deep betrayal and toxic manipulation, it is naturally tempting to seek vengeance or demand apologies that will never arrive. However, Cassidy demonstrates that the ultimate power lies in radical detachment and relentless self-improvement. By redirecting her energy away from her abusers and toward her own boundless potential, she built an untouchable legacy. Her magnificent success became the absolute loudest answer to their cruelty. Have you ever turned a painful betrayal into your greatest success story? Share your experiences in the comments below.